One of the really great ways that you can support our program, specifically just the Thom Hartmann program here, and all the work that we're doing, is by going to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, all run together, and signing up. You know, become a supporter of our program. And we have special content that's only available to our Patreon supporters, including a rant that we just put up about this amazing thing that I just learned. I learned this from Professor Barack Orbach of the University of Arizona Medical School, or Law School, that Robert Bork's bizarre idea that it doesn't matter how big companies get, it doesn't matter how destructive they are of competition, it doesn't matter how they wipe out local communities, all that matters is that consumers have low prices, led to directly the Walmartization of America. It was adopted by the Supreme Court in '77, by Reagan in '82, and it's still the law. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. This is, our book today is Playing with Fire, the 1968 Election and the Transformation of American Politics by Lawrence O'Donnell. The first chapter, Seizing the Moment, it starts in 1968. Richard Nixon was in a makeup chair when he met Roger Ailes. Maybe it was the makeup chair that set Ailes off. He was looking at the man who might have been president right now if he had just sat in the makeup chair CBS offered him in Chicago before the first televised presidential debate in American history. Nixon had ignored the network's makeup artist and used a drugstore product called Lazy Shave to cover his heavy 5 o'clock shadow. Nixon once said, "I can shave within 30 seconds before I go on television and still have a beard." The day after the debate, the Chicago Daily News ran the headline, "Was Nixon sabotaged by TV makeup artists?" Richard Daley, the all-powerful Democratic mayor of Chicago, said, "My God, they've embalmed him even before he died." Nixon lost the election to John F. Kennedy by 0.2% of the vote, 49.7% to 49.5%. In an election that close, every mistake matters. A mistake like not getting the makeup right was the kind of thing that infuriated Roger Ailes. Now, 7 years later, Ailes was meeting Nixon for the first time in the makeup room of the Mike Douglas show. At age 26, Ailes looked like an assistant, but he was the boss, the executive producer of the show, and Nixon was once again a presidential candidate in what was beginning to look like a crowded field covering the 1968 Republican nomination. Ailes wanted Nixon to be president, and he knew the most powerful force blocking Nixon's path to the White House was television. To win the White House in the 1960s, you had to understand and respect the power of television. Ailes also knew that one of Nixon's potential rivals for the Republican nomination understood everything about television, Ronald Reagan, the former film and TV actor. Ailes wondered what Nixon had learned about TV since the makeup disaster of the 1960 campaign. Sitting in the makeup chair, Nixon offhandedly mentioned to Ailes how silly it felt to try to reach voters by appearing on an afternoon talk show like this one instead of a news show like Meet the Press. The Mike Douglas show is targeted at housewives and usually populated by B-list showbiz celebrities. In response, Ailes instantly rattled off a list of every bad move Nixon had ever made on TV, and it was a long list. Ailes was a teenager when he'd seen some of these things. This was not the way people talked to former Vice President Richard Milhous Nixon. There was none of the deference Nixon had become accustomed to over the decades, and Nixon loved it. Nixon made Ailes an offer he couldn't refuse. Instead of trying to make Mike Douglas America's biggest afternoon TV star, make Richard Nixon America's next president. With Ailes on the media team, the Nixon campaign was ready to make the move from being the worst TV campaign to the best. "We're going to build this whole campaign around television," Nixon told his media team. "You boys just tell me what to do and I'll do it." Roger Ailes' career in Republican politics, which included every day he ran Fox News, turned out to be longer than Richard Nixon's. Ailes became more influential in Republican politics than Nixon ever was. We have reason to wonder who would be president today if Richard Nixon had not provoked Roger Ailes in the Mike Douglas show makeup room. Such are the seeds that were planted in American politics in the 1968 presidential campaign. Run, Bobby, Run is the subhead for the next part of this. Bobby was a natural on television. In 1967, he was the only potential presidential candidate who could charm a TV audience just by being himself. All he needed was his smile. Bobby was the Elvis of American politics, the only politician who didn't need a last name to identify him. But his last name was everything. It was Bobby Kennedy's last name that made every potential candidate fear him. As the field of candidates began to take shape in 1967, every campaign calculation depended on Bobby, even when he showed no signs of wanting to run, even when he told people he wasn't going to run. President Lyndon Baines Johnson feared Bobby to the point of obsession. Johnson thought Bobby was the only one who could do the unthinkable, challenge the incumbent president's grip on the Democratic nomination. Johnson was sure that Bobby was the only Democrat who might dare run against him. He was wrong. Nixon feared Bobby too, as did every Republican planning a campaign. Nixon knew exactly what to fear. He had lost to a Kennedy before. Losing to a Kennedy meant losing to the Kennedy political machine, and it meant losing it to the Kennedy style. A political machine can be beaten by a better political machine, though Nixon had never seen a better political machine than the Kennedys. Kennedy's style was something else. Nixon knew there was nothing Ailes could do for his image that could compete with Kennedy's style. Nixon couldn't change his sharply receding hairline. At 54, he was too old to do anything but tamp down his short, dark hair as flat as possible on his head. Bobby's hair had grown longer every year of the 1960s. Now at 42, he had the shaggiest hair in the United States Senate. His little brother Ted was the only other senator with a full head of hair. Bobby's hair was beginning to grow over his ears, rock musician length for the Senate then. And everywhere Bobby spoke outside the Senate chamber, he was treated like a rock star. That's what Nixon and Johnson feared most about Bobby, the way the crowds responded to him. They'd never seen anything like it in politics. Nixon and Johnson were both old enough to remember the first time anyone saw fans screaming and swooning for Frank Sinatra in the 1940s before, during, and after every song Sinatra sang. America saw an even more intense version of that fan reaction when the Beatles landed in the United States in 1964. And now Nixon and Johnson saw a version of it happening to Bobby. Everywhere Bobby went, crowds worked themselves into frenzies. When he spoke, he didn't sound like any senator they'd heard before. His voice wasn't stiff and self-conscious. The book Playing with Fire by Lawrence O'Donnell.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And happy Tuesday to you, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Congressman Mark Pocan is here with us, even though it's Tuesday and not Wednesday, for our full, for the day, Middays with Mark. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin. Pocan.house.gov is his website. You can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. He will be with us for the hour taking your calls at 202-808-9925. So if there's something on your mind, if you have a question, if you want to make a point, lobby the congressman, here it is. Congressman, welcome back.
Oh, thanks, Tom. Glad to be here, and greetings to your listeners.
And thank you for joining us today. I'll be out of town tomorrow, and I know that you had a change in airplane things and all kinds of stuff, and so this just kind of worked out for both of us. I'm so glad you could make it.
Yeah, no, thank you. In fact, today I was supposed to be flying to John Dingell's funeral in Michigan. Debbie Dingell is a very good friend and a colleague, and served with John my first session. And I guess, from what I understand, the flight, they didn't have enough seats for everyone, so all of a sudden I got bumped at about 6:08 last night by seniority, and then I heard the flight, when it went there today, couldn't land, so it had to return. So,
oh, my.
Yeah, but our thoughts are definitely with the Dingell family, and, Debbie Dingell is one of the co-chairs of the Medicare for All caucus and a really great colleague of mine. So
yeah.
We're definitely thinking about her and her family.
Yeah, he dictated or wrote a really thoughtful piece the day before he died. I mean, that was extraordinary. About America needing to come together and the strife that basically Trump has sown. I don't recall if he named Trump. I don't think he did.
Yeah, and he's had an amazing Twitter account that I think he's 92. He was 92, and
yeah,
he kept that up himself. So, but anyway, that's where I was supposed to be. But very glad to be here today with everyone.
There you go. Middays with Mark has been moved to today. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls at 202-808-9925. Congressman, I'm seeing just a couple of things here in the news. Laura Clausen over the Daily Kos writing, the headline kind of says it all. White House plans to strip disaster relief from California and Puerto Rico, but not Texas, to build Trump's wall. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think hopefully by later today we will have some sort of response from the White House on the supposed deal that negotiators came to last night. To be perfectly honest, the details I have are what I'm reading in press accounts. We haven't been given any more details. I saw that already Sean Hannity and some conservative Republicans were knocking it, so that means there may be something good in it. But my guess, and this is just my guess, this is not coming from our caucus or anywhere else, is that he may very likely not accept it because he wants another short-term CR, followed by another short-term CR, followed by another short-term CR so that we're constantly, in his opinion, tied up and not able to do oversight, and that we're constantly negotiating with him and Republicans over this. What he doesn't understand is we've got plenty of committees that are doing oversight that have nothing to do with the negotiations, so things are going to continue. But I think this is part of his strategy to make it so that we're not talking about the Mueller report or any of his staff that have been indicted or flipping on him.
I would view that as a media strategy. I mean, this is a guy who did a reality TV show every week for 11 years. He understands how important it is to reset the show, every week. You've got to restart everything. And so if he can keep us in a constant state of anxiety, confusion, and discussion about his wall, number one, he keeps, feeding racism to his base, which is pretty breathtaking. And number two, he distracts us from discussing, the fact that he's putting lobbyists in charge of the EPA and the Interior Department, that they're raping our lands, that they're robbing our working people, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's just it's like it seems like it hadn't occurred to me what you just suggested, that he wants to have continuing resolutions, every other week or something like that, into the distant future. But now that I think about it, it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I just think there's a possibility. Again, this is not a mainstream thought here in Washington. This is my opinion from watching how he operates. But the fact that Republicans, the reason they came to a deal is because Republicans still understand that we don't need money for a wall. Don't forget, it's their language in the last appropriations bill that specifically said essentially no money could go to any designs after March of 2017, which is when his designs came out for the wall. And as I understand it, we don't have this 100% yet, but what I understand it is the language in this, again, says that the money that is appropriated can only go towards what we previously appropriated for fencing and things like that. He's still not getting his wall. They even know it's a dumb idea to waste taxpayer dollars on the wall. So, he's got even a fight among, I think, some of the more traditional Republicans. But for him, I think there's a whole other strategy. He's just trying to keep the narrative away from what he doesn't want to talk about, keep us tied up, he thinks, to some degree, to not do all the hearings. And we'll see what happens. I think we'll know by the end of today.
Yeah. Donald Trump tweeted on the day before yesterday, February 10th, quoting from a Gallup poll, quote, "Open borders will potentially attract 42 million Latin Americans," end quote. "This would be a disaster for the U.S. We need the wall now." He's just coming right out now and saying that his problem is not immigrants, it's Latin Americans. How does it get more racist than that?
No, you can't. Well, I mean, I guess you get in full gear. But short of that, I don't know. I mean, all of the comments around this are deeply embedded in a racist message. It's more than a dog whistle. It's a huge dog horn to his base, and they get it, and that's why he was just down at the border again, trying to appeal to that portion. But again, everything he said last night, if you talk to Veronica Escobar, who took Beto's seat, who represents El Paso, or you talk to Beto O'Rourke, for that matter, who had a competing rally last night. El Paso is one of the safest cities in Texas, and it's at the border, and it happened before any kind of protections were put in place. It's because of how the city is designed, and it runs very smoothly between the Mexico and U.S. sides and how things operate. So, Donald Trump, again, just went down there and lied to people. And
right.
I'll never forget when, one of the other rallies he had a couple rallies ago, and some woman in the upper Midwest, actually in Minnesota, said, "Oh, they may try to break into my winter home," because they believe his rhetoric that they're trying to sneak up here and hide, when in reality, I don't know many people who want to come across the border and sneak into a frozen lake home in Minnesota. But that is the fear that he's instilling in people, and that's how he gains his power. So it's for every wrong, evil, terrible reason he does these things, which makes it, really hard to take him very seriously.
Yeah, and just for the record, because I never heard it on TV this morning, and I watched several hours of it, Trump got, according to the El Paso Fire Department, Trump's crowd was 6,500, Beto's was 15,000. So, just for the record. Anyhow, we've got literally callers from coast to coast here wanting to talk to you, so let's start Middays with Mark here with Russ in Hickory Hills, Illinois, listening to WCPT. Russ, you're on the air.
Hi, yes, thanks for taking my call, Mr. Pocan. What I wanted to ask you is, going forward, what is the message going to be to counteract this socialists and far left that I'm always hearing out of Chris Christie and what's the guy from Ohio, Kasich. They're trying to say we're so far left that we can't be talked to, that the right is now the center. How are you guys going to counter-react this message? And Donald Trump's going to pick it up pretty soon.
Yeah, actually, we've been trying to use a different narrative among the Progressive Caucus, because when people talk about moving to the center, it usually isn't really representative of the center. The center of the country on values is things like Medicare for all, is things like debt-free college. It's things that when you poll, the majority of the people support, and that is the progressive issues that we're talking about, negotiating for better prescription drug prices for Medicare. I mean, those are all mainstream ideas, and that's where we have to argue. That is the center when you hit where the majority of people want to be, and it's not this false narrative. I mean, it's very clear they're trying to use socialism. They must have had Frank Luntz somehow go out there, and there's just a way, if they say it right, they can scare people, because, again, everything they do is about fear. Because, Cheney, on the day that Liz, get her name even, the first name, Cheney.
Yeah, Liz Cheney.
Yeah, Liz, thank you. She, on the day that Nancy Pelosi-Asorian brought up socialism in her remarks, and the president did at the State of the Union. So clearly, they're trying to spin a very, very false narrative when we're saying, again, if you want the center of the country, 70% of the people support Medicare for all, including 52% of Republicans. That is the center of the country, and we have to change that debate so that those issues are considered centrist issues, because they are based on the popularity of the Republicans.
Yeah, and that's just going to require a lot of repeating, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're going to be doing a lot more polling this year to help drive that message home as well.
That's great. That's great. Congressman Mark Pocan is with us for the hour here on this Tuesday Live. Taking your calls, it's Middays with Mark. You can check out his website at pocan.house.gov. His Twitter handle is Rep Mark Pocan, and we'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Congressman Pocan is also the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And welcome back. Janet in Mount Vernon, Washington. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, Congressman Pocan. I have a question about the renegotiation of NAFTA, which is going on, and my understanding is that, at least according to Public Citizen, they had a lengthy article in their last issue, and it's being steered primarily by the oil companies and pharmaceuticals. And the pharmaceutical part is, I can tell you personally, I take a very expensive drug, and I order it from Canada. And my fear is that, A, they're going to stop the importation of drugs from Canada, and B, that basically the other part is that they don't really want to lower drug prices, the pharmaceuticals. They want everyone else to pay more. But this is where you come in, because this has to go through the House. So what I want to know is, what is the House doing to stay on top of this, so that the price of pharmaceuticals, which at least, some people at this point can actually get for a reasonable cost by importing them through Canada, that this is just not going to become a big, big mess.
And Congressman, if I could add, we had Lori Wallach on the program for about 10 minutes yesterday talking about this. She is the director, or whatever her title is, the big cheese over at Global Trade Watch, tradewatch.org. And boy, if you ever need an expert or somebody to talk to about this issue or any of the trade issues, she is top of the list.
Yeah, I know Lori very, very well. She's from Wisconsin, my home state. So,
there you go.
Yeah. So we go back, and we work with her very closely. In fact, I was going to let Janet know there's probably two major flaws right now that we try to highlight about this, barely different NAFTA, because it's not all that different. The president, again, is flying on that, but I know no one's surprised. One part of it is there are marginally better labor protections, but there's no enforcement of them. So without that, that's meaningless language, the marginal improvements that are there. The second part is on this, where they've made it so that some types of pharmaceuticals have longer protection periods than they currently did, and there's some other parts of this that are going to be detrimental to how we are trying to do right now with pharmaceutical drugs. I mean, a big fight we have right now is trying to be able to negotiate for cheaper drug prices through Medicare. We've got a number of other provisions. You're going to see a bill from the Democrats coming out very soon on prescription drugs, and this runs completely counter to that. So those are two major problems with that. We're very aware of those, Janet. We're working with public citizens, specifically Lori Wallach, and the unions and the environmental groups and the consumer groups on this. And I think right now it would have a hard time passing through Congress, and it has to before it ever becomes law. So even when the president says this is how he's going to pay for the wall, that's not true because it's not law yet, and it's going to have a hard time passing Congress in its current form.
Well, plus it's not going to generate that much extra revenue. Congressman, we just have 30 seconds to the break. How do you see Democrats using this issue? I mean, Sherrod Brown has been using this issue for years and years, very effectively, to win re-election in Ohio and to actually try to move the needle, too. He just hasn't had a lot of support, either from the Republicans or from kind of the old Bill Clinton faction of the Democratic Party.
This issue helps us put a major hole in Donald Trump's narrative about what he said about trade and what he says about prescription drug prices. So there is a connection between this, and we're actually sitting down with Phil Jayapal, the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, and I, with a pollster, I believe, Thursday to go over some of this very data.
Great. Okay, it's Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour on Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program. 20 minutes past the hour and a few seconds past that, and we'll be back with more of your calls for the Congressman in just a moment. One of the really great ways that you can support our program, specifically just the Thom Hartmann Program here, and all the work that we're doing, is by going to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, all run together, and signing up. Become a supporter of our program. And we have special content that's only available to our Patreon supporters, including a rant that we just put up about this amazing thing that I just learned. I learned this from Professor Barack Orbach of the University of Arizona Medical School, or Law School, that Robert Bork's bizarre idea that it doesn't matter how big companies get, it doesn't matter how destructive they are of competition, it doesn't matter how they wipe out local communities, all that matters is that consumers have low prices, led to directly the Walmartization of America. It was adopted by the Supreme Court in '77, by Reagan in '82, and it's still the law. Check it out. Patreon.com/Thom Hartmann.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
It's Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour on Middays with Mark, Tuesday edition. Dan in New Baltimore, Michigan. Dan, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Well, hi, Tom, and hello, Congressman Pocan. I'm concerned. My question is, if or when there's a market crash and they go to bail out the banks, if they do that again, I've read something about it's called a buy-in or a bail-in. Is that something that I should be concerned about? You know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't, Dan.
Congressman, this is I believe it's in the law now. There was a big debate about it in 2009 or 2010 about changing the banking laws to basically establish that your deposits with a bank, if you have a savings account with a bank, right now that's considered your property and the bank has to book it as a liability, that they would change that so that the banks could book it as an asset, which means that if the bank is going down in flames, before they take money from the federal government, they would first take money from their depositors. They would take your money, which is exactly what happened prior to 1932, and it's why the laws were changed in 32. And I frankly don't know for sure if that passed or not, but it was being pushed really hard by a number of people who were working on behalf of the banks in Congress back in the day.
Yeah, I think I would say this, Dan, to you. One, just from what I've heard about when people were around during the Dodd-Frank passage, and I think a lot of people believe bailing out banks cost the Democrats the majority, that people are going to be very cautious about doing anything too overtly supportive of financial institutions and consumers. I don't think you'll have that happen because of the past experience. And second, I look at the Financial Services Committee now. And, Maxine Waters is the chair, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, a number of really good folks, Katie Porter, go down the list. It's a really strong committee of progressives. I think that would be very difficult to see happen. So while I understand your concerns now, I just don't see that necessarily as being a realistic option.
Okay. Omar in Herndon, Virginia, you are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Tom, thank you for the town hall, and good day to Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, I just have two questions. Are there any resolution not to interfere in Venezuela in Congress right now? And the second thing, this Afghan peace process that everybody's been praising, we don't know that much about. The Taliban said they're not going to negotiate unless foreign troops withdraw from Afghanistan, and the negotiations not including the Afghan government. So what can you tell us about it? Have you briefed on this peace process?
So let me answer that second part right away. We haven't been briefed on it yet. So I think what you're seeing is often what I see is in the media accounts, so people talk about it. But, with Donald Trump, he is incredibly inconsistent for all his rhetoric around bringing people home. And I think he picked up a lot of support from trying to not be involved all over the world. He sends just a counter message when he dropped bombs in Syria, when he now is talking about a new leader in Venezuela and a lot of other areas. We just don't believe him. So I think, that one, I'm not sure if we can believe the president again with what he's working on in Afghanistan. On the issue of Venezuela, there is a resolution David Cicilline has for no military intervention. We've had a number of letters that have been put together by a number of us in Congress. And I think, the greatest concerns that we have, while the conditions are quite bad in Venezuela, and Maduro is not going to make anyone's list of best leaders of the world, us coming in with any kind of regime change, whether it involves military interventions or heavy sanctions, you can't just declare someone else the leader like the president has. I think a lot of those things are slippery slopes that we're very nervous on, and that's why we're being very active in that area. So there have been a number of letters. There is a specific resolution on military intervention. But I think we got to watch this closely because I am watching some other leaders in Congress making comments that make me concerned.
Tulsi Gabbard, we just have 20 seconds at the break. Tulsi Gabbard's been kind of this person on the left, Rand Paul on the right. Do you see this protectionist or the non-interventionist sentiment growing in Congress?
Actually, Tulsi hasn't been part of this debate at all. It's been really Ro Khanna, Pramila, myself, Ilhan Omar, some others that have been a little more vocal on it. David Cicilline putting the resolution. But I do think that this is where we can maybe have some left-right agreement on non-intervention.
That would be a good thing. Congressman Mark Pocan is taking your calls for the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We're live. It's Tuesday. It's Middays with Mark. His website, pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at @RepMarkPocan.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
He represents Wisconsin's 2nd District in the House of Representatives, and he is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Back with your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. Guns for Hire, how the CIA and U.S. Army recruit mercenaries for white Rhodesia. It's a historical reprint of what appears to be a 1979 pamphlet, basically. This is from the introduction. It does have an ISBN number. It is available in book sources. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, actually this must have been published post-1980 because they're referencing Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, 270,000 white settlers, mostly immigrated since World War II, controlled the government and economy, ruling over the 7 million black Africans. The Zimbabweans cannot vote. They have been forced off the bulk of the arable land, and they have no democratic rights whatsoever. All labor performance in Zimbabwe is black labor, and it is intensely exploited, often at less than subsistence wages. Zimbabweans have been fighting European invaders since the early 17th century. Since the 1890s, they have been directly ruled by Europeans, at first in the form of a private British corporation, the British South Africa Company. Since 1923, direct political rule has been in the hands of the white settlers, currently led by Ian Smith and his fascist Rhodesian Front Party. It's important to note that the white settlers were originally given this direct local power as a, quote, self-governing colony of the British government, thereby creating a master-caretaker relationship. During these past 80-odd years, Western imperialism, the multinational corporations of the United States, Britain, and South Africa, has extracted huge profits from the exploited and oppressed Zimbabwean population via the subsidiaries of the Anglo-Americans, Lonrho, Amex, AMAX, Union Carbide, Mobil, ITT, and other corporations. They fully intend to continue doing so as long as they can. The white settler minority has been rewarded for their violent subjugation of the Zimbabwean people with perhaps the highest national standard of living in the world. Sir Roy Walensky, the former Prime Minister of the Central African Federation, which included what is now Rhodesia, once said, "This man Smith has an appeal. It's the appeal of an easy life. For $6,000 a year, you can have 5 servants, a swimming pool, and a lot." Beginning during the early 1960s, however, the Zimbabwean nationalist forces under the leadership of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, evolved the strategy of guerrilla war to liberate their people and land. It is proving to be very successful. There are 20,000 guerrillas in base camps in Tanzania and Mozambique, over 3,000 in Zimbabwe itself, and this number is continually rising. In a meeting between Stephen Solars, a U.S. congressman, and the ZANU guerrilla leaders, they were reported to reject the possibility of enlisting the assistance of Cuban or other foreign troops, declaring that if we cannot liberate ourselves, we do not deserve to be liberated. Despite Western propaganda to the effect that the U.S. and British only wish to avoid a bloodshed in Rhodesia, don't forget the Zimbabweans have been bleeding for almost a century, their real fear is that the liberation struggle will win. With this victory in sight, it is not surprising that the counterattack by the Smith regime has become more vicious and brutal. Actually, this must have been published pre-1980, because this is when Smith was still in power in Rhodesia. More than 250,000 rural Zimbabweans have been forced into concentration camps. Terrorist raids have been conducted against Zimbabwean refugees in Mozambique. Dusk to dawn shoot-on-sight curfews have been instituted and enforced in the border areas. And escalating counterinsurgency attacks have been launched against the military arm of the liberation struggle, the Zimbabwean People's Army, ZIPA. It is crucial for Westerners to understand that the Smith regime has not stood alone in this barbaric campaign. This pamphlet documents the critically important element in U.S. imperialism's support for the Smith regime, white mercenary reinforcements for the fascist Rhodesian, quote, security forces. This flow of U.S. mercenaries to prop up white Rhodesia is an important, though secret, part of U.S. imperialism's strategy for Africa. The U.S. has massive investments in southern Africa. Zimbabwe alone supplies the bulk of high-grade chrome ore used in the U.S. for jet engines and other advanced technological items. Coal, copper, and other minerals are ripped out of Zimbabwe for U.S. industry. Mobil Oil, Texaco, Hertz Rent-A-Cars, Holiday Inns, and many other U.S. corporations operate illegally in Rhodesia through foreign subsidiaries. More important still is South Africa, the fortress of U.S. interests in Africa, where $1.5 billion is invested by GM, IBM, Ford, and other giant multinational corporations. The liberation of Zimbabwe would, for the first time, penetrate the buffer zone of satellite countries protecting the borders of South Africa. South African guerrilla fighters, who are already training by the thousands in camps in Tanzania and Zambia, would have direct access to re-enter their land and accelerate the liberation struggle. Knowing that the stakes are high, U.S. imperialism has worked to strengthen the white supremacist outposts in Africa, although at times this had to be done covertly. In 1970, the Nixon White House approved Henry Kissinger's Operation Tar Baby strategy, based on Option 2 of the Secret National Security Study Memorandum No. 39. This strategy essentially called for covert military assistance, including direct exchanges, so the South African troops could be trained in the U.S. in specialized tactics and weapons. This would be done while the U.S. tried to convince Africans that it was on their side. This is from the pamphlet number 39, that Kissinger memorandum. We would maintain public opposition to racial oppression, but relax political isolation and economic restrictions without openly taking a position undermining the United Kingdom and the UN on Rhodesia. We would be more flexible in our attitudes toward the Smith regime. And it goes on from there. Guns for hire.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Congressman Mark Pocan is on the line with us. It's Middays with Mark Tuesday edition this week. Taking your calls for the hour. Pat in Yakima, Washington. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi. And I apologize for not having a succinct question, but I am calling about recycling. It's very, very difficult these days to recycle. You cannot recycle glass. If you have a printer, you cannot gift it. No charity will take it. And there's no recycling for it. Is anyone addressing this?
Pat, I don't know, because generally this has been something that depends a little bit on the locality and the community on how extensive the recycling is. I know in Madison, Wisconsin, for example, they have a very, very extensive recycling program. Still accept lots of different types of materials. Some things that are fairly common, like corrugated plastic. There's some major centers around the country that can take it, but that's why not everyone does recycle that material, because it's not done locally. But I don't know if there's a national solution that's been proposed on it, and I don't know about your locality's specific situation.
Lowell in Salem, Oregon. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello, Congressman Pocan and Tom. I have a big concern with retirements in America. Over half the working population age 55 to 64 have zero saved for retirement. And I was wondering if the Democrats had some plan to help those immediately in danger of living in extreme poverty.
Even if the majority of them are Trump supporters. Thank you, Lowell.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Lowell, this is something we talk about quite often. We've talked about just last week with Nancy Pelosi, a number of us who meet with her weekly, that we need a retirement plan in this country. It's not just the fix for the Central States Fund, which is a multi-employer fund that's putting a lot of people at jeopardy. But as you pointed out, half the people in the country have Social Security and their home. About a third, or maybe it's up to 40%. No, I think it's about a third of the people just have Social Security to rely on, and that's really not enough to get by in most situations. Another interesting statistic: about 1 out of every 8 people has $200,000 even going into retirement, which again these days isn't a whole lot, especially as people are living longer and longer. So this is something that we do need to have a bigger national solution. We're talking about ways to try to get to that. There's not an immediate plan that I can say this is the best example of what's out there, but we certainly are very, very cognizant that this is one of those unaddressed issues that we need to put on the table for working families to make sure that people can retire in dignity.
Pam in Fort Collins, Colorado. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom. Are you calling me?
Yep, you're on the air, Pam.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. I had a quick suggestion for Lowe regarding the retirement. A simple solution is just raise the cap on Social Security, and then it's solvent for the foreseeable future, and we can increase our benefits going out. Just a thought, but that was not my question. I wanted to thank you both for what you do and giving us an opportunity to have a voice. I had a comment about all the investigations going on in the Mueller investigation, and now I'm grateful the Dems are getting into it. My concern is, are we going to hold these people to account? I really believe we need to create a system where we have the people at the top are held to much higher standards, and that's not the case. Because you see some of these characters coming up over and over again throughout history, creating these crimes over and over again, such as Manafort, Flynn, Elliott, Abrams, Barr. If we had held them to account way back in the era when they first started these kind of criminal activities, we wouldn't be where we are today, I don't think. Also, I think if we held them to serious account by giving them prison time and making them have financial consequences, you're creating a general deterrence for the rich and the elite, and again, you're keeping them from continuing that activity. And as an example, because I think the justice system, not only do we have a problem with inequality as far as finances, but also the justice system. Reality Winner's mother wrote a brilliant letter about her daughter with regards to Flynn being not, recommending no jail time. And here her daughter is sitting in prison for trying to alert the American public by releasing one-page document, is my understanding, that the Russians were interfering with our election. And this poor young woman is being abused psychologically and physically through solitary confinement, while Flynn, who did these horrible things and tax evasion and all kinds of stuff and colluding with foreign governments, hostile governments in many cases, it looks like, is being recommended no jail time. So I think in this case, as we go through this process, I am concerned that it's going to be elephants all the way down. I think the Republicans are
Pam, what's your question?
Involved. I'm getting there. They're heavily involved in this, and that's why it speaks to their strange behavior and blocking the oversight. So my question is, what are Mueller and the Democrats doing to hold these members of Congress to serious account, and not just these slap on the face hands or just, public humiliation, but really putting them in the prison system that they've created to profit on, et cetera?
Sure. Well, thanks, Pam. First of all, real quickly, when Lowell was talking, I think he's talking bigger than just Social Security. I agree with you. If you lift the cap, you can keep Social Security in alive for well over 75 years, but still, that's a relatively low amount of money, and we need to actually address retirement and retirement savings and issues around that to give full dignity to folks. I just wanted to add that because I do think it's important because it is a bigger issue than just Social Security. Specifically, Pam, Mueller, we don't know exactly all the details. I think when you see sometimes they say no jail time, it's because they're getting something else out of them, more information to go after someone usually higher up the food chain, and that's what we're waiting to see. So I can't speak for Mr. Mueller and some of what he's doing, but generally that is a tactic to get more information from folks who maybe had more ability to drive orders, and that's part of why maybe the president doesn't want us talking about all the people that he's hired who've been indicted, because that's an issue. I do agree that I think one thing I have noticed is that often, especially when a member of Congress gets in trouble, all they simply have to do once they get brought into an ethics investigation is resign, and then the investigation ends. And that doesn't seem proper, because then somehow average people are more accountable to a criminal justice system than people who are maybe in a privileged position.
Anthony in San Jose, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Oh, shoot. Thanks, Tom. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay.
Hey, Mr. I know you're from Wisconsin there, and I know that Scott Walker had his deal with the unions and kind of disintegrated them. I want to know what the people in Wisconsin that work in that sector and what the people that deal with that sector feel about that situation, because I am a public sector worker and I'm concerned about the Janus situation, or decision, I'm sorry.
Yeah, a great question, Anthony. So, AFSCME, Public Employee Union, was created in Madison, Wisconsin. I actually did a paper in college on it. I went into the archives and found all kinds of stuff. So we have a rich history of that. And Scott Walker, you're exactly right, did everything he could to destroy public employee unions, and then also private sector unions as well, because we became a right-to-work state, and then he started messing around with prevailing wage laws. So no one is happy with that. It has had a negative effect. A lot of people, good, talented people, left public service because of that. Teachers, we've had 50% decline in people applying to the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to become teachers, which is unfortunate. The maybe good news I can offer out of this is, while Wisconsin happened early, as we saw these attacks in preparing for the Janus decision that really continued to hurt public employee unions, they got better and ready for it. And when I talked to Randy Weingarten from AFT, for example, they've had a very small drop in the last year after Janus in membership, because they were prepared for it and they were talking to their members and had conversations. So we still need to do much more to give people their a voice in their workplace through collective bargaining rights. But fortunately, I think the unions did get ready for Janus, and we're not seeing quite the decline that I think the Republicans had hoped when they, whether it be Janus or had these actions by people like Scott Walker.
Patricia in Portage, Wisconsin. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I write a column for the Capital Times for wildlife and life in general, and I'm concerned that the Progressive Caucus is not taking on moving us to a plant-based diet to save this planet, because it is half of climate change. It is destroying the Amazon. We are losing species from all ends of the spectrum. Insects are plummeting. Large mammals are going. The whole system is, and we need to change this now. I mean, we don't have time anymore, and we need to be less cruel. We need to end slaughterhouses. We need leadership now. So I'm hoping that you'll take this on and educate yourself and get involved in it.
Well, thanks, Patricia. I can tell you that I think between a couple of things happening, one, Democrats taking the majority, and now we have committees with jurisdiction doing things around climate change, because we actually believe the science of like 98% of the scientists. Second, there is a special committee formed to deal with climate change that's been now populated with members and will start convening. And third, the new Green Deal was released last week with lots of prominent Progressive Caucus members behind it. And that is not necessarily prescriptive of all the details, but it opens up what we all need to do to figure this out in a relatively short amount of time, which could include the subject you brought up and a lot of other subjects in this area. So I think the good news is there's much happening on this front that hasn't happened, at least for the last 6 years I've been in Congress, and hopefully we can take some of these ideas, have the presidential candidates take some, and really address climate change as it needs.
You know, the USDA has always responded to essentially lobbying from the meat and dairy industry to put meat and dairy on the food pyramid and all that kind of stuff. And now we're seeing that basically they've been scamming us for the last 50, 60 years. Do you think the Congress might toss some money in to research plant-based diets and reorganize the food pyramid and stuff like that? Just basic recommendations for our school kids?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, because, I think one of the things also, there's been some really powerful documentaries just in the last couple of years around both the plant-based diet, about sugar, about a number of things that are health concerns that have had impact from lobbying. And, one extra thing I just got to throw out, Tom, is you got now about 10% of the members of the House of Representatives not taking corporate PAC money. So where all those lobbyists used to come in and, people had events and raise lots of money from, that's not happening for a good chunk of Congress, and that's going to help change things.
Yeah, that's a really good thing. Congressman Mark Pocan is with us, taking your calls for the hour. It's the Tuesday edition of Middays with Mark. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives. His website is pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at Rep, as in Representative, R-E-P, Mark, M-A-R-K, Pocan, P-O-C-A-N, Rep Mark Pocan.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment here on the True People's Media, the Thom Hartmann Program. Welcome back. Grace in Glendale, California, watching on Free Speech TV. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, thank you. Congressman, my question is regarding income inequality. I work in a university. It's nonprofit. The vast majority of the work that we do is funded by government grants. However, all the money is still going to the top, and the director is making millions while lots of staff are living below the poverty line. And I'm just wondering what can be done in Congress about this, if there's a way to cap the percentage between the amount that the people in the top are making and the people at the bottom, or if that, for whatever reason, isn't going to work, then, what Congress can do to address dealing with this kind of what I think is an abuse of government funding.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, one of the things Leader Pelosi has been very serious about as she talks to us this session is that we want to deal with income inequality in a substantive way. And she doesn't exactly lay out how, if that's going to be a special committee, if we're going to have a special focus. But every time we meet as a group, as Progressive Caucus leaders with some of the other caucus leaders, this issue comes up. So it is absolutely going to be a part of what we're pushing. One bill that I did when I was a state legislator in the Wisconsin legislature that I believe Barbara Lee has right now, which is a bill to limit the tax deductions for excessive salaries. So I think what the bill does is you can deduct from taxes your CEO compensation up to 25 times the lowest paid employee. But if you want to pay them more, you can do that, but you can't deduct it from your taxes. And that's one vehicle I know that we can do to try to address it. And I think Congressman Sabo originally had that years ago from Minnesota. Now Barbara Lee picked it up. That is an example of what we can do. So I think there's plenty of other measures, but this is certainly on people's radar screens as we're talking about tax rates on the top. It's also, and I would argue almost more important, that we're talking about how you lift the wages for those on the bottom and how you address the whole disparity in the top salaries and bottom salaries. I think you're going to get a lot of that in the coming months.
Fritz in Palm Desert, California. A quick one, watching us on YouTube. Quick one for Congressman Pocan. We have about a minute and 15 seconds.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Congressman Pocan, I'd like to suggest that perhaps, because we know that the Republican Senate won't touch H.R. 1, that the House resubmit a bill and attach the $5.7 billion that Trump wants for his ineffectual wall. That way, we get things that the country really needs, and he gets his silly wall.
Yeah, I think the only flaw with that, Fritz, is even Republicans think it's a silly wall. It's only the president, and I don't even know if he believes it. He just does it for his racist part of his base. So the problem is, as we see with the negotiations right now, Senate Republicans aren't fighting for a wall either because they know it's a waste of money. So I get your point. What I can tell you on H.R. 1 is if they don't take it up, we're going to break it up into pieces and send it that way. We're not stopping with just a single bill going out there. We know we got to clean up Washington.
That seems like a real winner in terms of publicity and promotion, if you can get any kind of news coverage of it.
That's exactly the point, Tom. It's also about education. If we can just let people know, I thought Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did a great job of showing the problem, the disconnect with money and legislation.
Yeah, she absolutely does. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. It's Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program, coming up on 9 minutes before the hour. We'll be back in just a second with more of your calls for Congressman Mark Pocan. Stick around. Just did a rant about how we have actually passed a major climate change tipping point that we can't walk back from. We can't stop it. This is coming now. It is unstoppable. This first step of it, which has to do with, the destruction of major cities in the United States and all around the world. You can check this out over at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, or for people who support us on YouTube as well, you can see this. Get over to patreon.com/THOMHARTMANN to check this out. We're talking about how prior to a couple of years ago, and this is how, tipping points, you can only see them in the rearview mirror. Prior to a couple of years ago, in the winter, the Arctic and Greenland, the Antarctic and Greenland, would recover some of their ice. Now they're not even doing that. It's just pausing. The melting is just pausing. That's that tipping point. And the consequences of this are going to be terrible. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Congressman Pocan taking your calls. Stephen in Albany, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, guys. Love what you do. Thank you. I'm with Physicians for National Health Program, both nationally and here in California, as well as back in the day, Tom. You might remember the joint issue in the Lansing. But my question is as far as Jayapal's bill, single-payer bill is concerned, it's our understanding that it's going to allow for large for-profit institutions to be providers of care, which is a big concern because they're more interested in profit, just like the insurance companies are, than they are in curing people. I'm wondering if you know anything about why those institutions are still in the bill.
So, Stephen, I can tell you this. I have not seen the final language. I believe they have the final, what they think is the draft, but I have not had a chance to see it. But what I can tell you is the bill is going to parallel closer to what Bernie Sanders' bill was in the Senate than what the previous bill was in the House. There were a number of problems because that bill had been written well over a decade ago that were making it not realistic that it was going to pass. So the bill is mirroring the Senate bill much closer. We're trying to put one big idea out there for the presidential candidates to talk about. But, the Medicare system is something that is wildly popular, and I think, basing it on the Medicare system is what I think ultimately will be the easiest and best way to move forward a single-payer system. So I think she's doing a great job on talking to all the interested parties on this. I know there are a few folks who just want to keep the old bill, but I'm telling you, the old bill won't pass. So if you want health care in a single-payer format, getting on to with what Bernie Sanders has in the Senate and she's going to have in the House is the way to go.
Charles, in Opelika, Florida. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, good afternoon, Congressman Pocan. I'm calling because I want to know, do you at least look at it like these Republicans, no matter what, they want to get rid of all our social services as far as Social Security, go down the line, whether it's housing for poor people or food stamps. And I believe once you introduce this wall, it's just going to be never-ending funding to go towards the wall, where one of these days we're going to have to make that decision, food stamps to the wall, security or helping the poor people. And I just don't think we get that as Democrats, because there's no way in the world I would like to get Donald Trump off the hook right now. And by trying to compromise with him in any way, we're stopping him. We're stopping, the rest of the country from seeing the fraud that's being taken place in the highest office in our land.
Yeah, so Charles, I believe what you're referring to is the deal that's being proposed. We haven't seen the exact language of it. We've seen how it's been reported by the press. From what I can tell from those reports, it is essentially the same amount of money that was in the last appropriations for things that aren't the wall. We were trying to deal with some of the detention bed issues because clearly those conditions are terrible. There's cheaper and better, more efficient ways to do it. I do think that this is Donald Trump's white whale. I don't think there are Republicans who support it strongly, but when you talk privately, they realize this is a boondoggle, that this isn't going to solve anything, and that this is a waste of money. And while they still may want to trim other programs back that match their ideology, I don't think that there's an organized effort by Republicans in swapping dollars from public assistance to the wall. I think this is Donald Trump made a terribly stupid campaign promise, trying to live up to it to keep parts of his base, the more racist parts, happy. And, we don't know what the president's going to say, because I watched during the break him back and forth on this issue. It's impossible to understand where this guy stands on anything until he's told, I think, by Fox News where he's going to stand. But from what I can tell right now, I don't think that's exactly what the compromise is, as you represented. I don't think the Republicans are looking to do that.
In our last 10 seconds here, Congressman, what should we look for this coming week?
Clearly, whatever the president does by probably today on this deal, I don't think there'll be a shutdown. I think it's next to impossible, but we could get another short-term resolution. We could have some sort of a deal. Watch for that, because it'll determine a lot.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for being with us this week.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Always great having you on. Congressman Mark Pocan, pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at @RepMarkPocan. We'll be back. Daylight savings time. Stick around. I'm sorry, Sean.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is by Robin Marty. It's titled Handbook for a Post-Roe, as in Roe v. Wade, for a Post-Roe America. And the cut line on the front says, the future without Roe is coming straight at us. This is the roadmap you need for the tough times ahead. This is from Chapter 7, page 101, titled Knowing Your Comfort Zone, Why Civil Disobedience. Access to abortion and birth control isn't just a health care issue and an economic issue, it's also a civil rights issue. And like every civil rights battle, gains are made through acts of civil disobedience or working outside the legal framework. Married people officially gained the right to access birth control only after Estelle Griswold, the executive director of the Planned Parenthood League of Connecticut, opened a clinic and began offering contraception in direct opposition to the 1960s state law forbidding it. That right was extended to single people in 1972 after Bill Baird was arrested in 1967 for purposely flaunting the Massachusetts law and publicly providing contraceptives to an unmarried woman during a college lecture. The Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion spent much of the 1960s and early 70s prior to the Roe decision, assisting pregnant people in finding safe abortions either from legal or illegal providers throughout the country and across the borders. And there were groups like Jane's Collective that provided the service themselves, even at the risk of their own arrest. Today, people are highlighting a number of issues through acts of civil disobedience. North Carolina had weekly mass arrests at their state capitol during Moral Mondays protests, while the Black Lives Matter movement physically closed highways with their bodies. And of course, when Brett Kavanaugh was appointed to the Supreme Court, hundreds of activists were arrested, some multiple times, for interrupting his hearings, protesting in the Hart Building when it became clear the Senate Judiciary was not going to investigate claims of past sexual assault. Some protesters even blocked the stairs prior to Kavanaugh's swearing-in ceremony. As our society recedes further into racism, sexism, xenophobia, and classism, opposing the power structure through nonviolent means grows more imperative. Aaron Mattson, the co-founder of the reproductive rights group Repro Action in Teen Vogue, wrote, "If Roe is overturned or gutted, it is certain that some states will propose and enact some abortion bans, new abortion bans. Again, nonviolent civil disobedience should remain on the table, this time targeting state and municipal level lawmakers. We must remember that while in several contexts abortion rights supporters lack immediate political power, in spite of the fact that nearly 7 in 10 Americans do not want to see Roe overturned, we always retain the power of using our bodies to stop or slow the machinery of state repression." End of quote. Mattson adds, ultimately, it's up to activists to decide. Are we willing to break convention if lobbying fails? Are we willing to strategically expose ourselves to the risks of arrest? And if we are not, are we willing to look into the eyes of the future generations who will be incarcerated for abortions, miscarriages, and pregnancy complications? End of quote. Repro Action is a growing network of state-based activists that conducts political events, teach-ins, and other direct actions to increased access to abortion and birth control services. They currently have national campaigns as well as individual campaigns in D.C., Virginia, Missouri, Arkansas, and Wisconsin. You can join up with or financially support Repro Action to increase their national and local reach. Subchapter title, Is Civil Disobedience Right for Me? What are you willing to do to make sure that you, the people you know, or even total strangers have access to contraception and abortion care, especially once more abortion options become illegal? Are you willing to be arrested if you participate in direct action or nonviolent protest? Is helping someone obtain abortion pills worth a potential prison sentence? Would you drive a teen to another state to get an abortion if that drive makes you an abortion facilitator and thus a federal criminal? You may believe you're willing to risk everything to help someone get an abortion, and that may well be what is needed in some cases in a post-Roe America. But make sure that you've really thought out all the consequences of such a radical approach. These are the questions you should be asking yourself now before new laws are put into place. One small silver lining of the Trump era is the way it has energized so many people to actively resist the political agenda. There are more activists, donors, candidates, and protesters than there have been in decades. And that means lots of people who can work together and step in when and where people are needed. But in certain geographic areas, it is and will continue to be harder to find those with the ability and privilege to do resistance work. For example, with the Trump administration's increasing militarization of ICE and border security, checkpoints into and out of America will be more scrutinized than ever before. With a population that in many cases is literally trapped in places like the Rio Grande Valley or Las Cruces, where undocumented people can neither leave the country for services nor go further into the U.S. for care, the need for additional action and people who have the willingness and ability to act may be greater than in New York City or the Bay Area. Maybe you have a very specific skill set. You might be medically trained, have a legal background, or maybe you've done counseling or social work, or you're a member of the clergy. These are people who will add a lot of value to the movement, especially if it turns out civil disobedience is the right way to proceed. Ask yourself if you're the only person who can do the thing you're considering doing, or if there's a number of people like you who are planning to step up. Then ask yourself what sort of risk you may be running and how those factors balance out. It's almost impossible to be a solitary activist these days, but there are spaces where you can manage. Letter writing campaigns, social media campaigns, information distribution, and fundraising can all be accomplished in a fairly solitary environment. Handbook for a Post-Roe America. One of the really great ways that you can support our program, specifically just the Thom Hartmann program here, and all the work that we're doing, is by going to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, all run together, and signing up. Become a supporter of our program. And we have special content that's only available to our Patreon supporters, including a rant that we just put up about this amazing thing that I just learned. I learned this from Professor Barack Orbach of the University of Arizona Medical School, or Law School, that Robert Bork's bizarre idea that it doesn't matter how big companies get, it doesn't matter how destructive they are of competition, it doesn't matter how they wipe out local communities, all that matters is that consumers have low prices, led to directly the Walmartization of America. It was adopted by the Supreme Court in '77, by Reagan in '82, and it's still the law. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. Thom Hartmann here with you. We just had an hour with Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls. It was fascinating. I think one of the most important things that I got out of it, one of the things that I thought was, was somebody called and asked him, is Trump ever going to get enough wall, and, what's going to make him happy, and what are you guys going to do, and all that kind of stuff. And Congressman Pocan said that basically Trump's doing a reality TV show. He's sucking up the news cycle, to keep us from talking about Mueller and keep us from talking about the corruption inside the Trump administration, putting lobbyists in charge of Interior and a lobbyist in charge of EPA and all that kind of stuff, and a lobbyist in charge of the FCC. And the crimes of the Trump crime family. It's, so if every week what Congressman Pocan said was he thinks that, every couple of weeks he wants to have a new continuing resolution so that there's always this drama. Is the government going to shut down? How far away from it are we? What's Trump going to do? And so that Donald Trump gets his name in the beginning of every story in the news every single day of the year. I mean, that's just always been the goal of his life, and that's what he's continuing to do. Our quote for the day is from Robert Reich. He says, anyone who has $1 billion either exploited a monopoly that should have been broken up, got inside information unavailable to other investors, bribed some politicians, or inherited the money from their parents who did one of the above. Right. It's brilliant. To step just a little bit out of the frame of politics for a moment, I wanted to talk to you about daylight savings time. And we can continue talking about the various topics that Congressman Pocan touched on this morning and the news of the day. El Chapo, by the way, was just convicted on all charges. He's going to prison for a long, long time. But for this hour, the question that I wanted to ask, the states are starting to pick, and this was a ballot initiative in California. I think it was also in Florida. In fact, it was. And that is, it has to do with daylight savings time. The spring is coming. In another month or so, we're all going to get an hour of jet lag whack. And people will die. Daylight savings time every year does cause some people to die. You see a spike in heart attack rates. You see a spike in car accidents. You see a loss of productivity in the first week or two after daylight savings time comes into effect in the spring. And so nearly 60% of California voters in November of last year said, let's just keep the state on daylight savings time all year round. Now, that's really great for people who are night owls. But for morning people would prefer that the country be on standard time all year round, because basically what daylight savings time does is it takes an hour out of the morning and shifts it to the evening. And during the summer months. So the question, so the question is, should we do away with the change twice a year to and from daylight savings time? Should we do away with that? And if we do, should we go to standard time, where we have early mornings, and people like me who have to get up? I get up at between 4 and 5 in the morning to put this show together and come in here and do this show, because we go on the air at 9 o'clock Pacific time. Do we go to standard time nationwide, and which is good for morning people and biologically morning people, or do we go with daylight savings time, which permanently, which is going to make for darker mornings, but especially in the winter, but actually I guess it would be no change in the winter, but it will be later evenings. And California's Proposition 7 is the one that passed in California, but now and the people said yes, let's just daylight savings time all year. I would be yes, standard time all year. One of the interesting things that we now know about this is that there's actually a genetic biology associated with being a morning person or an evening person, which makes a certain amount of sense. I mean, if you're looking at the evolutionary patterns necessary for the survival of a species, particularly a top predator like us, who are subject to other predators and subject to predators of our own species, it makes perfect sense that you would want to have somebody awake pretty much 24/7, when we were living as tribes and clans and family units, in forests and fields and jungles, that it would have been a good thing for there always to be somebody up, to always have a watch person, right? So you would have some people who are, work better in the evening, and some people who work better in the morning. It also explains why we have what's called bifurcated or diurnal, or there's a word for it, I'm missing the word, but that we all think that we're supposed to sleep 8 hours a night. But actually, when you put people in dark rooms for more than a couple of weeks so that their natural body rhythms start coming out, and there's some fascinating research done on this in France back in the 70s and 80s, what they found was that typically what people do is they sleep 3 or 4 hours. Well, actually, they sleep for a little while. Some people it's 1 hour, some people it's 5 hours. And then they're awake for an hour to 2 hours, and then they sleep for a few more hours. That's what's normal. And in fact, prior to electric lights and prior to artificial lighting with whale oil and things like that, which, the electric lights came along in the 1900s, the artificial lights, whale oil and things like that came along in the 1500s. Prior to that, people routinely got up in the middle of the night. They ate meals. There were recipe books about how to, they called it evening break. How to, what kind of meals are appropriate for the middle of the night snack. People had sex. People got together. Sometimes neighbors would get together in the middle of the night. There were books that were specifically recommended to be read in the middle of the night. And again, if you look at this evolutionarily, it makes perfect sense that, if I wake up for my hour in the middle of the night at say midnight, and my neighbor wakes up for his middle of the hour at 2 a.m., and my other neighbor wakes up for her middle of the night hour at 4 a.m., then between the three of us, there's always somebody awake all night long keeping an eye out for the tiger coming through the bush that might take us out. Right? I mean, evolutionarily, this makes perfect sense. And the extension of that, of course, is that some people are better in the morning and some people are better in the evening. So I don't know if there's a political breakdown to this. I'd be very surprised if it's tied to the same genes that seem to define authoritarian personalities. And that, there's not clear genetic data on that, but there is on this, on sleep. And, you know, daylight savings time is a relatively recent thing. Everybody blames it on Ben Franklin, but it was actually World War I when we started doing this to save electricity. And it became a national standard only in the 1960s. And now that we've been doing it for 50 years, we're looking back, you know, and seeing that, yeah, it slightly reduces lighting use, but it increases the need for heat and air conditioning. And so energy-wise, it's just a wash. But it causes heart attacks, workplace injuries, car accidents, all kinds of things. So which direction do you think that should go? A couple of other things in the political news, and then I'll be picking up your phone calls here, you know, right after this break in just a second. I got an email from Donald Trump this morning. Dear Fred, last night, because I signed up as Fred Flintstone, last night President Trump hosted one of the most important rallies ever, all caps, in El Paso, Texas. Congress's critical deadline to fund the wall is in just 3 days. The president was disappointed your name wasn't on the first list of official Build the Wall members we sent him the other day. Our movement to build the wall started when the president took his famous escalator ride to announce his presidential campaign. Today is the day. You can be one of the American patriots that finished the job and built the wall. And there's this little graphic there that has, it's an animated GIF, so it scrolls. And it's like, member, Lana S., $105, status renewed. Member, Dorothy K., $55 gift, status renewed. Fred, $0 gift, status pending. Roger F., $35 gift, renewed. Lucas B., $42 renewed. Please contribute at least $42 by 11:59 p.m. tonight to become an official Build the Wall member and get on the list that we send to the president tonight. This guy is raising money on his racist wall. Ted Lieu tweeting, the numbers don't lie. El Paso Fire Department crowd estimates. Trump, 6,500. Beto O'Rourke, 10 to 15,000. Some of the signs at the Beto rally, this is great. This Tackett posted this over at DU, Democratic Underground. Without immigrants, Trump would have no wives. Except for Marla Maples, right? He wouldn't have 2 out of 3. Stop pretending your racism is patriotism. Hate never made America great. Yeah, some great posts there. And of course, Don Jr. did the warm-up for the crowd last night. And he said, keep up that fight. Bring it to your schools. You don't have to be indoctrinated by these loser teachers that are trying to sell you on socialism from birth. Really? Our loser teachers are indoctrinating us with socialism? And finally, this from Laura Clausen over the Daily Kos. What does Puerto Rico need with disaster relief anyway? You know, they're good, right? Same with California. So they had some wildfires. Texas, they had a flood. Well, we're going to keep sending flood money to Texas. We're going to send them money to rebuild. The disaster money, the FEMA money, Texas is going to get that. That's a red state. But California and Puerto Rico, we're going to take that money and use it to build the wall. This is the latest scam that Trump thinks he's come up with. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And meanwhile, Donald Trump is tweeting, and this is, you know, Lawrence tried pointing out, Trump is saying, keep Latin Americans out of the U.S. This is white supremacy, pure and simple. Trump tweeted, open borders will potentially attract 42 million Latin Americans. This would be a disaster for the U.S. We need the wall now. Amazing. He's just coming right out and admitting it. I got some econ news for you, too, but we'll pick up your calls right after the break.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Daylight savings time, standard time, all of the above, none of the above. What do you want? And welcome back. Monica in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hey, Monica, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Well, I was listening to your rant about daylight savings time, and I was thinking, all my life I've been wondering the very same thing, why do we have that? And also, it occurred to me, why are we such slaves to the clock? Why don't we simply say, now, you know, use the clock as a guide, but say, okay, the sun rises at this time in the winter, so we'll go to school at 9 o'clock in the winter, certain months, then it goes to 8 o'clock and then 7 o'clock.
Mm.
And
Monica, that's actually how it was prior to roughly the 16th century. If you go back and you look at the history of clocks, and clockmaking, particularly for like the top of giant church towers and things, got really sophisticated in the late 1500s, the early 1600s, and a certain amount of industrialization was happening during that period as well in Europe. And so what happened was, prior to that, businesses would open right after the sun came up, and they would close right before the sun went down, year-round. And so people would get up when the sun came up, and they'd go to work, and then when the sun started going down, they'd go home and they'd have dinner, and that would be the end of that. And but with or they would work for a certain number of hours and then go home. But with the advent of the technology of well-built clocks, they started putting clocks on towers. When I lived in Steinach in Germany, this little town of 16,000 people out in the middle of nowhere, every hour, actually every quarter hour, the clock would chime. Every hour it does a big fancy chime, and every quarter hour it just does a bong. And that was to basically regulate work. And so, I think your idea is a good one.
And also, as far as work goes, we should pretty much do the same in certain businesses, too. There are certain businesses that I think that you should use the sun more as, things like restaurants and...
What if we all did that? What if every business just, kind of opened at sunlight, and, of course, then, what about something like this show?
In the winter, industrialists wouldn't go for that in the wintertime because you don't have enough sun, and so they wouldn't get enough profit.
At least in the north.
Yeah.
But people would have a better quality of life.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I mean,
as long as the industrialists get a good quality of life, hey.
Yeah, no, I remember so vividly. Louise and I, in 1997, sold an ad agency that we had built in Atlanta and retired to Vermont, bought a house way out in the woods, and I was just going to write books. And for about 2 years, we would get up with the sun, we'd go to bed with the sun. I would write during the day, but it's when I wrote The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight and The Prophet's Way. But we completely lived with the seasons, and it was so gentle, it was so comfortable, it was so nice. And then,
also we could do away with a lot of this light pollution that we have.
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities here. How far down this rabbit hole of industrialization and synchronization and everybody, and it may be irretrievable, but Monica, you're spot on. Thank you very much for the call. Great to hear from you, and thanks for watching Free Speech TV. It's 21 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls and thoughts right after this. Those folks who support our program, who help essentially sponsor us on YouTube and on Patreon, have access to content, special content that is generally not available on YouTube or anyplace else. In exchange for supporting us at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, you get the whole 3-hour show, a video podcast that's not available to the general public, that you can watch anytime you want for every single show every day, plus special content that is not available anywhere else. The rant this week: 200,000 Americans have died from overdoses involving prescription opioids since 1996. So the question, what do we do with a company and the individuals who own that company and run that company that has been directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 Americans? What do we do? We've got a serious problem with an out-of-control pharmaceutical industry in the United States, and we need and product liability in general. We need to do something about it.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thom Hartmann. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Monica just called and we were just talking about what if we were to just kind of make this transition to the way things were before roughly the 1600s in this world, or at least in Europe. Prior to the 1600s, basically businesses opened in the morning when the sun came up and they closed at night when the sun went down. And we all used the sun as what defined our times. Yeah. Paul in Quilcene, Washington. Am I saying that right, Paul?
Quilcene.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, all your listeners, Tom.
Cool. Thanks for listening to KSER. What's up?
Well, you punched my nonpartisan button on this one.
Okay.
And this is this messing with the clock. Let's go back to the dateline, which is in Greenwich, England. The Earth turns at a set rate. Every so many degrees is an hour.
I think the international dateline is actually out in the Pacific.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. I don't mean it. At the Greenwich Mean Time.
Yeah, okay. Right. That's the standard for the world, runs through London, yeah.
Right.
Or runs through Greenwich.
So they're trying to get out of the standard that the world has established. It is a set thing of physics, how fast the Earth turns and where the sun is. If a business wants to open earlier, hey, put your sign up, as she said. Winter hours, other hours, however you want to do it. It's a democratic way to live. But
so you're saying blow up daylight savings time?
Yeah, dispense with it.
Okay, so here's the question, Paul. We know that if we went year-round daylight savings time, which is what California just voted for, we'd have more time in the evening to play or to, the kids in the backyard or whatever it may be. You'd have less time in the morning. If we went all standard time, you'd have, earlier mornings and earlier evenings. Which would you prefer?
What you just said is not true.
Okay. What am I missing?
The Earth turns at a set rate. You don't get any more hours by changing the clock than what the sun gives us by the rate we turn.
Oh, you're right.
And so it's a matter of how you look at it, not what's physically happening.
Right.
If you want, you're not going to get more hours.
Okay, let me rephrase that then, Paul. If we were to stay with daylight savings time, kids would be going to school and people would be going to work in the dark in the morning, and after they come home, they would have more hours of daylight. Whereas if we went with all standard time, people would be going to school and going to work in the morning more in the daylight during the year than if we went with daylight savings time.
Only if you choose to. That's saying that you adhere to a specific hour of starting.
Yeah, okay, that's the discussion I was having with Monica. That's a different thing. Yeah. But basically, I guess the question, I'm assuming that partisanship on this essentially, and I don't mean in the traditional sense, is going to break down along the lines of morning person versus evening person. If you're a morning person, you're going to say, I want standard time year-round. If you're an evening person, you're going to say, I want daylight savings time year-round.
I say you should go at the time that suits you. But it messes with all manner of navigation and entrance and exits of ports for people and for goods. And it makes it, in fact, this part of the trouble we have when different states have it and don't have it as far as daylight savings.
Right. Hawaii doesn't have it right now. Half of Arizona doesn't have it.
Enough said on that, and I'll let somebody else speak. I have one thing for you. This is a bumper sticker.
Okay.
And it's something I would wish both for you and for Mr. Trump. May you receive in abundance all that you wish for others.
Ha! Okay. Thank you, Paul. Brilliant. Brilliant. What a great bumper sticker. We'll be back with your calls right after the sticker on. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. Viagra for your brain. Just don't tell Limbaugh he'll want some.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Yeah, probably not a good idea to tell Trump about that Viagra for your brain thing either. We'll be right back. In the Thom Hartmann Book Club today, our book is by Frantz Fanon, and it's The Wretched of the Earth. This is from the chapter on national culture on page 145. It sort of reads like Thomas Paine, actually. Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in relative opacity. In the underdeveloped countries, preceding generations have simultaneously resisted the insidious agenda of colonialism and paved the way for the emergence of the current struggles. Now that we are in the heat of combat, we must shed the habit of decrying the efforts of our forefathers or feigning incomprehension at their silence or passiveness. They fought as best they could with the weapons they possessed at the time, and if their struggle did not reverberate throughout the international arena, the reason should be attributed not so much to a lack of heroism, but to a fundamentally different international situation. More than one colonized subject had to say, "We've had enough." More than one tribe had to rebel. More than one peasant revolt had to be quelled. More than one demonstration had to be repressed for us to stand firm, certain of our victory. For those of us who are determined to break the back of colonialism, our historic mission is to authorize every revolt, every desperate act, and every attack aborted or drowned in blood. In this chapter, we'll analyze the fundamental issue of the legitimate claim to a nation. The political party that mobilizes the people, however, is little concerned with this issue of legitimacy. Political parties are concerned solely with daily reality, and it is in the name of this reality, in the name of this immediacy which influences the present and future of men and women, that they make their call to action. The political party may very well speak of the nation in emotional terms, but it is primarily interested in getting the people who are listening to understand that they must join in the struggle if they quite simply want to exist. We now know that in the first phase of the national struggle, colonialism attempts to diffuse nationalist demands by manipulating economic doctrine. At the first sign of a dispute, colonialism feigns comprehension by acknowledging with ostentatious humility that the territory is suffering from serious underdevelopment that requires major social and economic reforms. And it is true that certain spectacular measures, such as the opening of work sites for the unemployed here and there, delay the formation of a national consciousness by a few years. But sooner or later, colonialism realizes it is incapable of achieving a program of socioeconomic reforms that would satisfy the aspirations of the colonized masses. Even when it comes to filling their bellies, colonialism proves to be inherently powerless. The colonial state very quickly discovers that any attempt to disarm the national parties at a purely economic level would be tantamount to practicing in the colonies what it did not want to do in its own territory. And it is no coincidence that today the doctrine of Cartierism is on the rise just about everywhere. Cartier's bitter disillusionment with France's stubborn determination to retain ties with people it will have to feed, whereas so many French citizens are in dire straits, reflects colonialism's inability to transform itself into a nonpartisan aid program. Hence, once again, no need to waste time repeating, better to go hungry with dignity than to eat one's fill in slavery. On the contrary, we must persuade ourselves that colonialism is incapable of procuring for colonized people the material conditions likely to make them forget their quest for dignity. Once colonialism is understood where its social reform tactics would lead it, back come the old reflexes of adding police reinforcements, dispatching troops, and establishing a regime of terror better suited to its interests and its psychology. Within the political parties, or rather parallel to them, we find the cultured class of colonized intellectuals. The recognition of a national culture and its right to exist represent their favorite stomping ground. Whereas the politicians integrate their action in the present, the intellectuals place themselves in the context of history. Faced with the colonized intellectuals' debunking of the colonist theory of a pre-colonial barbarism, colonialism's response is mute. It is especially mute since the ideas put forward by the young colonized intelligentsia are widely accepted by metropolitan specialists. It is in fact now commonly recognized that for several decades, numerous European researchers have widely rehabilitated African, Mexican, and Peruvian civilizations. Some have been surprised by the passion invested by the colonized intellectuals in their defense of a national culture. But those who consider this passion exaggerated are strangely apt to forget that their psyches and their egos are conveniently safeguarded by the French or German culture whose worth has been proven and which has gone unchallenged. I concede the fact that the actual existence of an Aztec civilization has done little to change the diet of today's Mexican peasant. I concede that whatever proof there is of the once mighty Songhai civilization does not change the fact that the Songhais today are undernourished, illiterate, abandoned to the skies and water, with a blank mind and glazed eyes. But as we have said on several occasions, this passionate quest for a national culture prior to the colonial era can be justified by the colonized intellectuals' shared interest in stepping back and taking a hard look at the Western culture in which they risk becoming ensnared. Fully aware that they're in the process of losing themselves and consequently of being lost to their people, These men work away with raging heart and furious mind to renew contact with their people's oldest inner essence, the furthest removed from colonial times. Let us delve deeper. Perhaps this passion and this rage are nurtured, or at least guided, by the secret hope of discovering beyond the pleasant wretchedness, beyond the self-hatred, something that redeems us.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Yeah, Sean was just saying, why, you know, if we're going to do daylight savings time, why don't we make the change Friday night instead of Sunday night? I mean, you know, give us the whole weekend or Saturday night. You know, give us a day or two to recover before we have to go to work and deal with morning traffic and all this. This is crazy stuff. Wes in Oak Park, Illinois, listening to WCPT. Hey, Wes, what's up?
Hey, Tom, I just wanted to say I think you and perhaps all the other callers are overlooking what I think is probably the greatest benefit of keeping daylight savings time.
Okay.
And that is just basic human fundamental satisfaction and marital harmony. That night in the spring, when we put those clocks forward, that's the one night each year I get to make love to my wife for an hour and 4 minutes. Thanks, Tom.
For an hour and 4 minutes. Thank you, Wes. That was a good one. Mary in Bainbridge Island, Washington. Hey, Mary, what's up?
Hi, I'm really, really glad that you're bringing this up, because I just found out that we are also having this put on our ballots.
Yes, it's going to be on the ballots
State.
in both Oregon and Washington State this fall, or maybe next year. And you know, California just voted on it a few months ago, and also daylight savings time is coming in what, 3 weeks? I think it's March 10th or 11th, something like that. So
I don't know. It's disgusting because I'm a psych nurse practitioner and have been looking at this idea of how it affects sleep and the things that you brought up earlier, that it's dangerous, that this thing it is jet lag, it causes a lot of car accidents and a lot of other things aside from heart attacks or whatever. And so, and I'm also a morning person, so that the thing is, in Washington, it really doesn't matter, since as a person who had to work nights, and when I was working in the hospital, you know, we get light here in the summertime at 4 o'clock in the morning and stay light till 10. So it really, all of that didn't matter a lot. But I agree. I think it's a bad idea. The other thing is, I worked with kids, and my thought was the reason that adolescents don't fall asleep or need to have more sleep in, like they go to sleep later, is because I figured that in the olden times, they were the ones that stayed up all night and stayed up late to protect us from the
predators.
Yes,
yep.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so that's what I would tell my families. I say, well, this is normal.
Oh, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, you know, the biology of this is absolutely irrefutable, and now that they've identified genes associated with that biology, yeah, we know that this is nature, not nurture. There are some people who their normal body rhythm is to wake up an hour or two after daylight, and other people whose normal rhythm is to go to sleep, you know, an hour before sunset. I mean, you know, we're all wired slightly differently in that regard, and as I said earlier, I think that that's part of our, you know, one of the keys to our evolutionary survival. Mary, thank you. Thank you for your contribution to our conversation. John in Morris, Illinois. Hey, John.
How you doing, Tom?
Great.
Simply, you know, just leave it alone. Regular, you know, God set the times.
Well, except that God didn't create time. I mean, you know, time is a man-made invention. It's an artificial thing.
He didn't do the numbers, but if you read Daniel 7:25, it'll tell you exactly. They change times. How much time do you waste changing all the clocks in your house?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Although they're,
it's a waste of time.
Increasingly they're connected to the internet, and so they do it automatically. But so your suggestion. So John, you're saying don't change to and from daylight savings time every year. I get that. I think probably most people agree with that. Then the question becomes: do we stay on daylight savings time year round, or do we stay on standard time year round?
Standard Time. I work swing shifts. You modified the swing shifts to the time when you work. That is everything else can modify. Just leave the way it was planned from the very beginning.
Okay. All right. Well, at least from the 17th century. Yes. Okay. John, thank you. Jody, in Sturgeon Lake, Minnesota. Hey, Jody.
Hi. I just started homeschooling so that I could let my child sleep and have her own clock. However, my dilemma with the changing of the program is that we still have to live in the world. And I live in northern Minnesota, where it would completely wreck things if we did not have daylight savings time. And
how so? It gives you an extra hour of light at night, but in the summer, but only in the summer. And in the summer, you've got a lot of light anyway.
Winters. I'm sorry, it's the winters. It's the winters.
But we don't do daylight savings time in the winter.
They are, and I'm sure it's not the same for southern states, but it is so hard in the winter to wake up in the dark. And I lived in Alaska for a while even, and it was the same there. However, where I lived in Alaska, it was warmer than where I live in Minnesota.
Sure.
So it was a little bit easier, and you got to watch the sunrise over the mountains.
Yeah.
So
Jody, are you suggesting that in the winter, in those northern parts of the United States, and this would be interesting to get some Canadians in on this conversation because they're farther north than we are, that what we should do is have a different kind of daylight savings time that we go into in the winter, where we set the clocks. Well, we would again set the clocks ahead. So 8 o'clock we set the clocks back. 8 o'clock becomes 7 o'clock, so that we can sleep in an extra hour in the winter.
I don't know what I really suggest, because we are a big country.
Yeah.
And it might be very different for the southern states.
So then we should change our federal laws so every state can just decide how they want to do it? What does that do, though, to things like airline schedules and TV calendars and stuff like that?
True. I just want the northern part of the country to be considered.
I get it. Jody, thank you. That's an important point. And having lived in the North most of my life, outside of 13 years in Atlanta, all of my life, New Hampshire, Vermont, Michigan, and now in Oregon, I totally get what she's talking about. Sean in Stamford, Connecticut. Hey, Sean, what's up?
Hi, this is a fascinating topic, and I thought I put my 2 cents in, and I thought an idea might be simplify, which is just move the clocks a half hour in between, and just leave it. That way, you get a little bit of both, and you get a little bit of balance, so you don't have to worry about one extreme or the other.
Sean, you should be in Congress. Your instinct is to compromise. That's brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. No, because living here in the Northeast. And the sun sets in New York around 8:30 in the summertime. Well, if it's 8 o'clock at night, no one's going to worry about half an hour. But in the wintertime, you have sunrise about 7:20 in January, and if you it's 7:50, but school is out to start, so you don't lose too much. But you have a healthy balance.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're getting someplace here. Sean, thank you. Manuel in Houston. Hey, Manuel.
Yeah, good morning, Tom. Listen to you every day. Love your show.
Thanks.
Anyway, just comment about I'm for a standard time because raising children, you're trying to get them to bed by 8 o'clock, and they say, but it's still light outside.
So you want the morning? You're arguing the morning person argument here on behalf of child rearing. I get it, and having.
I just thought I'd joke about that.
No, hey, Louise and I raised 3 kids. I know exactly, and I was one myself. I know exactly what you're talking about. Manuel, thank you very much.
More issues, but that's for another day. Thank you, sir,
there you
for
go.
the program.
Great. Thank you, and thanks for watching us down there in Houston, Texas on Free Speech TV. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul.
Tom, I think what we should do is fall back 6 times a year, every 2 months. We get an extra hour of sleep, and then after 4 years, we'd have accrued 24 hours, and we could get rid of leap year.
Okay.
Just saying, I mean, it would be weird.
You've been working on that for a while, haven't you, Paul?
We'd all be working in the dark. Night would be day and day would be night, if you know what I mean.
Right.
But it would come back and we'd all get more sleep.
Okay. All right. Well, some great tongue-in-cheek suggestions here, too. Paul, thank you. Charlene in Mesa, Arizona. Hey, Charlene.
Hey, Tom. Arizona tried daylight savings time and found that with the longer afternoons and evenings, and that's when the higher temperatures would occur, we would just cook. So we do not participate in daylight savings time.
Oh, is that why? I couldn't figure out, why does Arizona not do this? It's because by doing that, you have higher air conditioning costs in the summer. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Wow.
When the highest temperature occurs around 4:30 every afternoon.
Right.
So, when you're running 110, 115, that would impact us greatly. So we don't do it, and I'm so happy we don't do it.
Do you know if Arizona did it for a while and then backed away? Because it seems
they
like
did it. They did it for a while. I don't know at what point, what the date was, the year was. They tried it, and they found it was disastrous with the temperatures, and they went back to doing Mountain Standard Time all year long.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
Which is crazy because in the summer we're actually on Pacific Time because we stay where we are and they jump ahead. So.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, Arizona and Hawaii are the two states that have opted not to do daylight savings time. And Hawaii doesn't because they're basically on the equator, so they've got a 12-hour day and night year-round. It doesn't matter to them. Interesting stuff. Charlene, thank you. We're going to be checking in with Talk Media News here in about 4 minutes. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's 45 minutes past the hour and a little bit of change here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Talk Media for the rest of us. And welcome back. I'm not hearing a lot of people voting, essentially, for standard time year-round or daylight savings time year-round, which would be standard time for the morning people, daylight savings time for the night people or evening people or whatever. Wayne in Charleston, New Hampshire, you want to vote on this?
Yeah, Tom. I listen to your show all the time, and I love it. Anyway, I've worked night shifts and day shifts, and I guess I'm a morning person. I'll vote for standard time, because when I had to work the night shifts, I was constantly tired all the time.
Yep, been there, done that, and
you know about it.
Yeah, no, and trying to even think at night is difficult for me. I mean, as a writer, right? I can.
And then you got to get up. You come home at midnight, so you're in bed by, let's say, you clean up and everything. You're in bed by 2. Then you're up at 9. And then you're looking forward to getting ready to go to work by 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You're constantly tired.
Yeah, I'm with you. Wayne, thank you for the call. Rich in Indiana. Hey, Rich. Didn't Indiana go on and off daylight savings time at one point?
What I remember is that they were talking about the little kids at the bus stop early in the morning in the dark getting hit by cars.
And so they quit the daylight savings time, or they started it? I don't remember which it was, but I remember there was a...
All I remember is that they were trying to keep kids out of the paths, kids as road users.
Right.
Road users in harm's way.
Right. So it was a safety
from
thing.
Getting hit by cars because people drive so crazy around here. I mean, I thought I knew crazy. I've visited Massachusetts.
Yeah.
They got nothing on Hoosiers. Hoosiers are nuts.
Really?
Anyway. Oh God.
Okay.
Anyway. All I can do is truth tell about how bad it is here in Indiana. All right. The reason that I gave you a call, please, is that I wanted to bring the topic of, and it got to the previous caller saying the fatigue thing, the quality of light. There's a documentary called Stare into the Lights, My Pretties, by Jordan Brown, and it's about screen culture, and there is this whole aspect of the illumination of a little screen of a electronic device being on the internet that is a certain frequency, and it has this biochemical effect, which ain't so good. And then think about how the fight to illuminate the darkness with electric light has moved through the centuries.
Yep.
First bulb, 1879, I think, Edison's, and the idea that the industrialists want to spread work so that a factory never shuts down. And now they're saying that we can own things in a gig economy and a sharing economy, so that we can always be using things all the time. Everything is just in time, and all of this is about maximizing profit by those who are the capitalists, those who own the capital.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
and you can take this back to the 16th century or the 17th century. Yeah, I'm with you, Rich. I'm sorry we're out of time, but spot on. Remarkable. Quite a conversation. More than I expected. We'll be back with Luke Vargas with Talk Media News in just a moment. Stick around. One of the really great ways that you can support our program, specifically just the Thom Hartmann program here, and all the work that we're doing, is by going to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, all run together, and signing up. Become a supporter of our program. And we have special content that's only available to our Patreon supporters, including a rant that we just put up about this amazing thing that I just learned. I learned this from Professor Barack Orbach of the University of Arizona Medical School, or Law School, that Robert Bork's bizarre idea that it doesn't matter how big companies get, it doesn't matter how destructive they are of competition, it doesn't matter how they wipe out local communities, all that matters is that consumers have low prices, led to directly the Walmartization of America. It was adopted by the Supreme Court in '77, by Reagan in '82, and it's still the law. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
So let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Loving What You Do, Ellen Ratner's new book. On the line with us is the chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News, joining us from the UN headquarters in New York, Luke Vargas. You can hear his 2-minute podcast or news summary every day by just Googling his name, Luke Vargas, or plugging it into wherever you get your podcasts. Luke, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks. Glad to be with you.
Glad to have you. A couple of economic indicators are starting to pop up. I saw this piece in the Washington Post today. The headline kind of says it all. A record, and it literally is a record, 7 million Americans are 3 months behind in their car payments, a red flag for the economy. This is even worse than during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Yep. And I understand that there's a few others. What's going on here?
So the sort of good news first, and then we'll get to the bit you just talked about. You hear this morning we're learning 7.3 million job openings were advertised in December, which is a record high over any point over the last 2 decades. So that's a good sign, and you are seeing this sort of phenomenon for about the last 12, 13 months now, where typically the number of job openings is far lower than the number of people who are unemployed. That has reversed, and so you do, have an environment which, at least theoretically, should lead, or has in the past led to higher wage growth, which is that these, in order to fill these 7.3 million jobs, employers will need to increase what they're paying people.
Which historically is the point at which the Fed freaks out and raises interest rates. I mean, Alan Greenspan famously said that his most important job as chairman of the Fed was to maintain a certain, and I quote, minimum necessary level of worker insecurity, end quote.
Exactly. Well, but you haven't really been seeing that inflationary pressure. I mean, you're right. Seeing the wage growth over the last years that it should be over 4% is what I'm told for this kind of low unemployment rate, but it's only been holding around 3%. So clearly this money's not getting plowed to workers. sort of the sad bit about this otherwise good statistic. I mean, and the one that you referenced, the 7 million Americans now are 90-plus days behind on their auto loan payments. You're right, it's the highest since the financial crisis. Millennials are a really concerning trend here. They're the fastest rising cohort who are falling behind in their payments. Evidence, I think, pretty clearly that this gig economy really isn't giving many people, especially young people, the financial security.
Oh wow! I wonder, Luke, how many of these people who are behind on their car payments are people who bought a car to do an Uber or a Lyft gig,
wow.
and then they discovered that they couldn't make it, and they can't pay their. I'll bet that had a huge impact on this.
That's a great question. I would be really curious to dig into that. I didn't see that in any of the coverage today, but maybe that number exists. And then finally, I'll just say, this all is sort of in the background. I just keep worrying about the student loan bubble, which is $1.5 trillion now. There was a really interesting Fed report last month that and data on these things takes years to put together. So this is a 2014 data they're looking at, but they assessed 2014 and said that, among people, I think who are under 35, who they consider young people, 400,000 people in the U.S. should have been owning homes in 2014, but could not because of high levels of student debt. That is, right. We're just seeing less equity building up. So, my grand takeaway is you probably hear the president talking about that 7.3 million job openings. There's a much bleaker picture behind the scenes when you start factoring in student loan and housing problems and just sort of in general debt levels and a lack of wage growth. It's not pretty.
Yeah. Meanwhile, John Bolton has come out and said, spies? We don't need no stinking spies. I don't care what our intelligence agencies say. Or words to that effect. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you could write speeches for him. There was a White House video last night marking the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And Bolton quotes here saying, Iran continues to seek nuclear weapons to intimidate peaceful people all over the globe and make ballistic missiles as a delivery system, end quote. I mean, this is just such a direct contradiction of what the Director of National Intelligence told Congress last month. Every, sort of a public official, other than these White House officials who are in the intelligence community, basically are saying there's no evidence Iran is doing any of the enrichment that would lead to creation of a weapon. It's worth pointing out, Iran has threatened that if it does not receive the economic benefits that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, were meant to bring about, that they would consider returning to an enrichment pathway that could create a bomb. But they're not doing that now, and this is a blatantly false claim from a White House that seems pretty willing to push the envelope and risk creating rising tensions or, God forbid, even a war with Iran. It's just amazing to keep hearing these false claims.
Yeah, it truly is. And the World Health Organization warning about hearing loss among young people. Is this from listening to music on iPod kind of things?
You nailed it. They said over 1 billion young people are at risk of hearing loss, debilitating hearing loss from headphones in particular, gaming and music. Currently, 466 million people suffer from debilitating hearing loss. Could swell to 900 million people by 2050, which is 1 in 10 people around the world. It's not a very sexy issue, but it's actually pretty cool what they're doing here behind the scenes. They're trying to work with, and the reason they haven't announced this until now is because they wanted to, seems get these partnerships up and running. But they're working with Apple and other manufacturers to basically create internal software on phones to study your listening habits and volume habits and figure out a way to sort of train ears to be receptive to music at lower levels. That's urgently necessary.
The big problem we have right now, there's a piece about this in the New York Times last weekend, is called loudness. And that is where normally you have peaks and valleys in music, but now they're raising the valleys so that even though the peaks aren't any higher, which is what gets clipped by a volume control, the average is so much higher that it's damaging the eardrums. Luke Vargas with Talk Media News. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Yep.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
One of the really great ways that you can support our program, specifically just the Thom Hartmann program here, and all the work that we're doing, is by going to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, all run together, and signing up. You know, become a supporter of our program. And we have special content that's only available to our Patreon supporters, including a rant that we just put up about this amazing thing that I just learned. I learned this from Professor Barack Orbach of the University of Arizona Medical School, or Law School, that Robert Bork's bizarre idea that it doesn't matter how big companies get, it doesn't matter how destructive they are of competition, it doesn't matter how they wipe out local communities, all that matters is that consumers have low prices, led to directly the Walmartization of America. It was adopted by the Supreme Court in '77, by Reagan in '82, and it's still the law. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. Our book club book today is Last Boat Out of Shanghai by Helen Zia, the subtitle, The Epic Story of the Chinese Who Fled Mao's Revolution. This is from the prologue, Shanghai, May 4th, 1949. Bing sat up straight in the pedicab, gripping the hard seat as the driver cursed and spat. She watched with alarm as his feet, clad in sandals cut from old tires, seemed to slow to a snail's pace just when she most needed speed. This stylish-looking young woman had imagined that her last hours in Shanghai would be spent waving farewell from a ship's deck to envious onlookers below as a river breeze gently lifted her dark hair, just as she'd seen in the movies. After all, she was about to leave China's biggest, most glamorous, and most notorious city. But now, with the imminent threat of a violent communist revolution, she was running away again, along with half the city's population, it seemed. And instead of standing at the rail, exchanging smiles with the ship's other passengers, she was stuck in traffic, terrified that she wouldn't reach the Shanghai Hongqiao Wharf in time. That would spell disaster. She lurched forward as the pedicab driver stood on the pedals of his three-wheeled cycle and came to a stop. Around her was a sea of other pedicabs, rickshaws, cars, buses, carts, and trucks, all screeching and honking, their drivers yelling every manner of obscenity. The cacophony reverberated against the walls of the stone and concrete canyon of Nanjing Road. Bing was no stranger to Shanghai's mayhem, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. Of all times to be stuck in such bedlam, on the very day she had to get to the riverfront, the date set for her departure from this desperate city. She'd sewn her floral print quipois for this special occasion. Each careful stitch had captured her growing anticipation. With her oval face, big eyes, and full red lips, all crowned by a tiara of black permanent waves, the 20-year-old might have been mistaken for a coy Shanghai poster girl, but for the panic in her eyes. Like her, everyone in Shanghai seemed to be in a frenzy to escape, to use any means to get away from the impending arrival of the communists. But unlike those who were still clamoring for a seat to anywhere, Bing was one of the lucky ones. She possessed a precious one-way ticket out on a ship to America. Finally, the driver managed to break through the crush. He harangued everyone in his path, shouting, "Move along, you worthless mule scrotum, smellier than pig farts." She didn't blink at his choice of words, which came as naturally as breathing on Shanghai's streets. She didn't care as long as she got to the wharf. The ship's smokestacks came into view just past the stately Astor House Hotel and the towering 19-story Broadway Mansion's apartments, where the Xinjiao Creek meets the bend in the Huaihangpu River, the last major tributary of the mighty Yangtze River before it joins the East China Sea. Massive granite buildings, all in European style, lined the signature waterfront boulevard and docks. To the foreigners, this prime section of waterfront was known as the Bund, from a Hindustani word meaning embankment. The Chinese called it Waitan, meaning outside or foreign shore, a reference to the foreigners who once ruled this proud imperialist showcase of Shanghai. British and American businessmen had wrested away the best sections of the port city with the full support of the government. Land and sovereignty had once been ripped from China, spoils of the opium wars that had forced the narcotic onto China 100 years before. Everything about these monuments to international capitalists and pale big noses seemed foreign, including the British Big Ben chime of the giant clock tower over the customs house. Soon it would be up to the communists to decide what would follow, what would happen to these grand stone edifices. Shanghai was China's most modern, populous, and cosmopolitan city. one of the leading metropolises of the world. The Paris of the Orient was also home to tens of thousands of foreigners who were despised by as imperialists by the Communist Party and its leader, Mao Zedong. The city was the launching point for major inland routes and international traffic, whether by boat, plane, train, or wooden cart, making it the epicenter for the massive exodus in the late 1940s. Stoked by the anticipated communist victory over the nationalist government headed by Chiang Kai-shek, panic and terror had first infected the wealthiest, most educated, and most privileged classes and sent them running in what they fully expected to be a brief exile. It was assumed that the communists would target the rich and the pampered in the same way that the Bolsheviks had gone after the Tsarist White Russians, many of whom had come to Shanghai as refugees from that 1917 revolution. No one knows precisely how many people fled Shanghai during the early years of the Communist Revolution. Scholars and journalists have estimated that more than 1 million people set off from or through that port city. Many of those who ran for the exits belonged to the city's capitalist and middle classes, who presumably had the most to lose under the communists. These two groups comprised about 5% and 20%, respectively, of the city's 6 million residents, or about 1.5 million people. On the other hand, the remaining 4.5 million who made up Shanghai's majority saw no need to escape. They included Shanghai's industrial workers, coolies, drivers, the destitute. But it was not only members of the upper classes who fled. They were joined by old regime loyalists, from high nationalist government officials to lowly foot soldiers, as well as those who simply got caught up in the frenzy or were especially fearful. Unfortunately, there are no records of the exodus, since the retreating nationalists destroyed as many documents as they could, while the incoming communists inherited a country in such disarray that no accounting of the departures is known to have taken place. Last Boat Out of Shanghai by Helen Zia.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the third hour of our program. Thom Hartmann here with you. We've been talking about daylight savings time. We've still got a bunch of people on hold who want to talk about that. Whether the entire nation, I mean, every year people die because of daylight savings time, particularly in the spring when we lose an hour. You have an increase in heart attacks. You have an increase in car accidents. You have an increase in on-the-job injuries. These are all well documented. And if we went with a nationwide standard time, that's good for morning people. But if you go with a nationwide daylight savings time, which is what California just voted to do in the last election, that's good for evening people. And some of us are one or the other. That's a biological certainty, a reality that we've relatively recently learned, is genetic. And, California voted to go all year, daylight savings time. Washington State and Oregon are both going to have it on their ballots this fall, or in the next, in the next election. I'm not sure whether it's this fall or a year from now. And so, we've been talking about that. We had Congressman Mark Pocan on for an hour taking your calls, which ranged across a whole wide variety of topics. We're still talking about those. We were just talking to Luke Vargas a minute ago. A record 7 million Americans are 3 months or more behind in their car payments. There are some who say this is a huge red flag for our economy. I'm wondering if this is a commentary basically on how many people have been, suckered into, and I don't mean that in the worst sense of the word, but how many people said, I'm gonna get rich, or I'm gonna make a living as a Lyft driver or an Uber driver, and they go out and buy a car to do it, and then they discover that as a driver they can't make that kind of money, and now they're stuck with the car and they can't make the payments. And I honestly don't know, what the reality is, what the bottom line is on all this. But the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and I wanted to get into in this third hour, and that we haven't yet talked about today, is Ralph Northam. Ever since it first came out that he was either in blackface in his college, his medical school yearbook, or put a picture of somebody in blackface and somebody in a Klan outfit on that page. Ever since it came out, I've called for his resignation, as has pretty much everybody else on earth. And Northam has said, I'm not going anywhere. And he's holding firm to that. And now we're getting polling that shows that a majority of Virginians don't want him to leave, and a majority of black Virginians don't want him to leave. They want him to stay on the job. And, which is, I was scratching my head on this, going, what's going on? And then Trevor Noah came out and did this bit, I believe it was last night. It might have been the night before. I've learned about it this morning. I read about it in the New York Times, actually, in an article in the New York Times titled, Trevor Noah says Northam's racism debt might be a good thing. Racism debt, in quotes. And, Trevor Noah makes the point that basically if you're a white guy who grew up in Virginia, or frankly most of this country, and you didn't at some point in your young life, and, Northam was 25, but whatever, say or do something insanely stupid that had to do with race, then you're really the odd man out. That this is probably true for the vast majority of white people. And, I think that's probably true. The fact that 2 out of the 3 senior officers in the Virginia government have been in blackface, and the third of those 3 is a black guy, so it's not like that's an issue for him, is a clue, right? But the point that Trevor Noah is making is that, well, I'll just quote him. He says, "Let me tell you, white guilt can be very useful, my friends. Black people in Virginia can ask Governor Northam for anything now. Better schools, criminal justice reform, a holiday for Beyonce's birthday. A black person in Virginia could ask Northam to pick him up from the airport, and he'd be like, I'll be there in 15 minutes. That's kind of the funny take on it. But the more serious take on it that he's laying out is basically, you now know who Ralph Northam is. And presumably, I guess the debate for Virginians is, has he genuinely had a come-to-Jesus moment? Or did he 10 or 20 or 30 years ago? Well, I guess this was 25 years ago, so 20 years ago. But the larger issue, I think, that Trevor Noah here is talking about, and that he explicitly, comes right out and says, is that here he is. He says, to black people, especially in Virginia, every white guy serving in office has probably done some racist stuff. So you might as well have a white guy who's already been caught and feels bad about it, because you know that guy's never going to mess up again. Well, it's interesting. I am still broadly of the opinion that Northam should resign. Obviously, the other variable that's been thrown into this, well, there's 2. One is that Republicans are caught in this kind of stuff all the time. The Republican. Here's the weird thing. Justin Fairfax, who's the lieutenant governor, he's the lieutenant governor, who's the African American of the 3, the 3 Democrats who lead the government in Virginia. If Northam steps down, he becomes governor. If Fairfax steps down, then the AG becomes governor. The AG was in blackface. If he steps down, then the Speaker of the House, who is a Republican, the Republicans control the House of Representatives or House of Delegates or whatever it's called in Virginia, the Speaker of that body picks the next governor. So you get a Republican governor, which is, of course, why the Republicans are pounding on this so hard. And at the same time that they're loudly screaming, hey, 2 credible allegations against Justin Fairfax, he needs to go. These are the same people who are saying, well, yeah, 22 women have come forward and said that Donald Trump sexually assaulted them, but so what? Right? I mean, we even know who he paid off. So what? So there's some serious hypocrisy at work here. And anyhow, I just tossed that out and see what your thoughts are on all this. The other thing that I thought was worth pointing out is that, and Seth Abramson is going off on this on Twitter in a really, really big way. His tweet from today, he basically taking on the media. And not just Seth. I mean, there's a bunch of people who are talking about this, that the media is saying, well, there's no direct connection that we've been able to find so far between the Trump campaign and Russia. But there's hundreds of indirect connections. And not just Russia, by the way. Saudi Arabia, Israel. There may be other countries. Turkey may be involved. And Trump obviously has financial entanglements. He's got a Trump hotel in the Philippines, and he's buddying up to a murderous dictator there. He's got, Trump towers all over the country, all over the world. So there's that. So there's really a lot on our plate today with regard to all this. And meanwhile, the Green New Deal, by the way, is moving forward. And that, it's not, just so you know, this is just one of those, the Green New Deal that has been put forward before Congress now by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and colleagues. 60 members of the House, 9 senators. This is not actually legislation. This is a resolution that says we would like legislation. And we would like, this is just a 6-page resolution, and it says we would like that legislation to, and I'm quoting from the resolution itself, to promote justice and equality or equity by stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression of indigenous peoples, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth. And one of the ways to get there is to put millions and millions of people to work solarizing and windizing the United States of America, building out an infrastructure for this country that will replace our fossil fuel infrastructure. Because, we've been on this fossil fuel economy since the late 1800s, and in a big way since the first decades of the 1900s of the 20th century. And, it's time to move ahead. So we'll see where that goes, too. So there's a lot on our plate. We've got a lot of calls, a full board full of calls stacked up here to talk about all kinds of things from El Chapo to the time zones. And holding Bob Barr accountable, all kinds of stuff. So we will get to your calls and more of the news of the day in just a minute. It is coming up on 16 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Talk media for the sane among us and the place where smart people get their news.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And by the way, El Chapo got busted. He was convicted on all 11 counts. This guy's going to jail. And welcome back. Thomas in Deer Park, Texas. Hey, Thomas, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how's it going, Tom?
Great.
Appreciate you for taking my call. You brought up something interesting on the third hour about Ralph Northam, the Virginia governor. Would you like to speak about that? Originally, I was going to talk about daylight savings time. But
sure. Well, you can toss out your opinion on daylight savings time and then you pontificate about Ralph Northam. Go for it.
Sure. Okay, well, essentially, I think we need to have a standard time. Like some of your other callers before me, I'm a swing shift worker as well. Work at a production plant over here in Deer Park, Texas. And, already my circadian rhythms are already kind of messed up from just that. So go ahead and throw in some time, national regulated time change, and that just makes things a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and just
You're absolutely right.
Time.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah,
standard time.
Let's get
so
Northam
Northam
there and stuff. Northam, yeah. So so I'm of the opinion, kind of like Trevor Noah. I don't know if it's just the generation in me. I'm 31 years old. Kind of grew up in the 80s, grew up in the early 90s. Racism's one of those. I grew up in Texas too. Racism's one of those things that was kind of sort of phasing out in a sense, but maybe not so much. I bring that up because Ralph Northam obviously grew up in Virginia at an earlier time than I did, when probably racism was more the standard than it is now, starting to phase out. So kind of can't help the way the guy grew up in some ways, and then in a lot of ways, if he's grown from that, as I imagine most men are doing in their lives, or learning and growing, then, why not say, okay, well, let's turn the other cheek and give this man a fair shot.
It would be nice if, as an act of contrition, he rededicated his life to working for racial reconciliation, and perhaps even something like, reparations.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm of the opinion that I believe racism more or less might be seeing its way out. I know it doesn't seem that way, especially with everything that's been going on with the current administration and just kind of the current social climate. But in a lot of ways, too, you got to see who else doing that. It's a lot of what I see the older generation kind of doing that.
Yeah.
And my younger generation, I have 2 children that I'm raising right now that, you know, they're not going to hear any racial epithets that I heard growing up, that their grandfathers heard growing up. And I think that's kind of where it starts, you know. And then if they do say, hey, this kid in my class, he's a little different than me. Well, hey, his skin color may be different, but he's just the same as you are.
Yeah.
You know, and has all the same worries and likes and what have you. So
Yep.
anyway,
Whereas somebody,
that's kind of
if you were to talk to somebody who grew up in the 50s, 60s, I would say even the 70s, really the whole television barrier got broken by Norman Lear in the late 70s, early 80s. Basically the only African American faces that you saw, people that you saw on television. In the cartoons, in fact, you even saw people in blackface, but the only people that you saw were people who were caricatured, people who were being portrayed as you know, dumb or lazy or what, you know, those stereotypes. And
absolutely.
And that, you know, that the little kids grew up with that, right? And that sticks, and that's something that, you know, you have to get conscious about and push through and just say, no, wait a minute, that is wrong. That is absolutely wrong. Yeah, I think you're right, Thomas. I think that the generation that's growing up right now, and it's not just for racism. I think the same thing happens, the same thing with regard to misogyny, the way that women are treated, and the same thing has to do with our non-cis, our non-binary brothers and sisters and thems and whatever. Family, thank you, Nate. Family. I'm still clumsy with all this stuff. Thomas, thank you for the call, and thank you, Nate. We'll be right back. It's 20 minutes past the hour. Just did a rant about how we have actually passed a major climate change tipping point that we can't walk back from. We can't stop it. This is coming now. It is unstoppable. This first step of it, which has to do with, you know, the destruction of major cities in the United States and all around the world. You can check this out over at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, or for people who support us on YouTube as well, you can see this. Get over to patreon.com/THOMHARTMANN to check this out. We're talking about how prior to a couple of years ago, and this is how, you know, tipping points, you can only see them in the rearview mirror. Prior to a couple of years ago, in the winter, the Arctic and Greenland, the Antarctic and Greenland would recover some of their ice. Now they're not even doing that. It's just pausing. The melting is just pausing. That's that tipping point. And the consequences of this are going to be terrible. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thom Hartmann. Welcome back, John in Hollywood, Florida. Hey, John, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I love your show. I learned so much listening to you and all the other listeners here. I wanted to clarify a little bit about the daylight saving time thing in Florida. It was not a ballot initiative. It was actually approved by the legislature to go to daylight saving time permanently, and we're waiting approval by the U.S. Congress. It needs to be approved by Congress.
Yeah, this law was called the Sunshine Protection Act.
Something like that. Yeah, I don't know. Actually, I'm in favor of that. I prefer. I'd like to see it done away with, the switching every 6 months or whenever it is.
Yeah, I agree.
I prefer to go to daylight saving time. I'm not really a night person or a morning person either, but I just like to have time at the end of the day to do stuff. Daylight, living in Florida where we're outside all the time. But another listener suggested splitting the difference, and I've always thought that would be the appropriate way to go, and then everybody gets a little bit, and it's not too bad for any one person.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, although that would put us at a significant disequilibrium with the rest of the world, because you'd have half-hour differences rather than hour differences.
Yeah, and that's always been the sticking point in my head too on that.
Yeah, that would be problematic. But I'm with you. I would be in favor of year-round standard time, but I would take year-round daylight savings time over what we've got right now in an absolute screaming heartbeat. John, thank you very much. Margaret in Aberdeen, Washington. Hey, Margaret.
Oh, hi, Tom. Thank you. Yes, I agree. Everyone has a different sense of time. There's night owls and other creatures that hunt and live at night. Early birds always get the worms that unfortunately stayed up too late in the darkness and they popped up in the light.
That's a great one.
Over time, agriculture and harvest were done in the daylight. Others, like mushrooms or other third shifts, they thrive at night. There is a place for both. And we're in a modern and global economy. You have Eastern, Pacific, Europe, 8-9 hours apart. But people, they should be able to accommodate people's preferences and work together with time differences. And, you know, we go back to the churches and the town clocks. And it was their way to regulate ourselves and write history and to figure out, you know, what we're doing with our lives. Scientists today are still trying to research time. And then we can think, and we still think we can capture time by clocks. Nature doesn't wear a watch. It's not tied to their bodies. It looks at the sun and it looks at the moon, and it knows when to work, whether it's an owl or early bird.
I agree with everything you've said, Margaret. What's your point?
The real question is, what do we do with the time we're aware of being given?
Yeah, well, that's.
I would follow the sun.
That's absolutely more of an existential question and an important one, Margaret. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Michael in Snohomish, Washington. Hey, boy, did I get a deja vu just then. Michael, speaking of time, I wonder if that is why. Michael in Snohomish, Washington. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Hi, yeah, I thought you were mistaken about talking about the clock towers in Europe. I was under the impression that the clocks were on the church towers in Catholic Europe so that they could make the peasants pray at the proper time, because the lords made the peasants work all the time.
Well, that may be, but the shop owners and the industrialists certainly embraced that.
Well, yeah, in the north of Europe, the clock towers were put on town halls as more of a showing off for the village to show how prosperous they are, but also because nobody had wristwatches or pocket watches. They hadn't been invented yet.
Right.
There was only the central clock tower to tell people what time it was and, like I said, when to pray.
Yeah. Fascinating.
But I think people should stop living by the tyranny of the clock. I mean, just because it's 12 o'clock doesn't mean you have to stop and eat lunch. I'm never hungry at noon. My doctor's office, he opens at 8 o'clock for his first appointment, but I won't go in before 1 o'clock. I mean, I don't pay it. I know what time it is, but I don't let that clock tell me what to do when.
Well, that's a nice luxury to have. You know, a lot of people don't.
Yeah, but I mean, why would a business, just because it's 9 to 5, business could be 10 to 6 or 11 to 4, whatever they want?
Well, if it's a manufacturing business, yes. If it's a retail business, you have to be open when people want to come buy things. But I get your point, Michael, and it's well made. Michael, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be back. It's 27 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, helping you win the water cooler wars. Stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator by Gregory B. Jackso, former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I'm going to start with the last paragraph of Chapter 1, and then I'll start reading Chapter 2. In hindsight, the Fukushima incident revealed what has long been the sad truth about nuclear safety. The nuclear power industry has developed too much control over the NRC and Congress. In the aftermath of the accident, I found myself moving from my role as a scientist impressed by nuclear power to a fierce nuclear safety advocate. I now believe that nuclear power is more hazardous than it's worth. Because the industry relies too much on controlling its own regulation, the continued use of nuclear power will lead to catastrophe in this country or somewhere else in the world. This is a truth we must all confront. Chapter 2. The Fukushima accident in Japan was not the first accident to belie the promise of nuclear power. In its early years, the commercial nuclear industry had only a limited understanding of the operations, science, and engineering of actual power plants. This ignorance led to the first major nuclear power plant accident just outside Harrisburg, the state capital of Pennsylvania, in 1979. 3 Mile Island prompted a flurry of reforms and a pile of promises that the public would be protected from future nuclear calamities. Through the mid-1980s, it appeared these promises were being kept. Construction on new plants slowly resumed without major accidents. Then suddenly, strange radiation measurements were detected in Sweden. Governments in Europe and throughout the world soon learned that a disaster had occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union. Like a developing photograph in a bath of chemicals, the reality of nuclear power was starting to come clear. One nuclear accident was an oversight, a mistake, an aberration. 2 nuclear accidents hinted at a serious problem with the technology. A third would cement the conclusion that nuclear power plants were simply going to have accidents on a relatively consistent schedule. After 3 Mile Island, after Chernobyl, the third accident nearly occurred in 2002 at the troubled Davis-Besse nuclear power plant in Ohio. The problem is that with each new accident, all the people in charge of nuclear safety seemed to revert to the belief that this one would be the last one. As chairman of the NRC, I battled nearly every day against this instinct to believe that the worst was over. You can prepare for the next accident only if you get all the players to admit that a next one is coming. Even if and when are impossible to predict. Before Fukushima, too many people I encountered simply did not believe the next one would ever come. Their view is not surprising. Accidents are rare, and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island had happened decades earlier. Yet I continue to believe I could challenge this complacency. I seized one opportunity just after I became chairman. 4 days before President Obama tapped me to lead the commission, I spoke at a conference organized by the North American Young Generation in Nuclear, an industry group of professionals entering the field as nuclear operators, designers of reactors, or academic experts in nuclear technology. As I looked out at the crowd, it dawned on me that many of these people had never lived through a nuclear power accident. Even if I had been only 9 years old when 3 Mile Island occurred, when Chernobyl happened, I was a teenager, more worried about surviving my freshman year of high school than about nuclear disaster. The people I was speaking to were even younger. I wondered how they had experienced these seminal events. Being a scientist, I decided to conduct an experiment. I asked everyone in the audience to stand if they were born after 1979, the year of 3 Mile Island. Nearly everyone stood. After they sat down, I asked them to stand if they were born after 1986, the date of the Chernobyl accident. Once again, nearly everyone stood. These industry-defining accidents have become dry case studies taught in college classes. The next generation of American nuclear power professionals has never experienced the confusion of a nuclear accident as it is happening. And so it's essential that we remember and teach the lessons of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, for reviewing these accidents shows common themes of missed opportunity, human failings, and technological overconfidence. No amount of forgetting can change these simple facts. The March 1979 accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania seems almost like something out of a science fiction horror film. The cover of Time magazine captured the national mood of chaos, confusion, and fear. The emergency read phrase "nuclear nightmare" slashed across the dark black cooling towers of the plant. There was no live-streamed video, as there would be after the Fukushima accident, but the public could imagine the scene inside the reactor. Just 12 days before the accident, The China Syndrome, a feature film starring Jane Fonda and Michael Douglas as reporters who uncover a major incident in a nuclear plant, had been released. Perhaps the hundreds of journalists gathered outside Harrisburg believed they too would land such a story. It started on March 28th at around 4 a.m. when a water pump stopped working. The failed pump affected the steam generators, large cylinders filled with many tiny metal tubes that help turn hot water from the nuclear engine into steam so that the turbines can generate electricity. When the flow of water was cut off, this massive heat exchange stopped working, creating the conditions for a serious accident. The reactor engine was immediately turned off, but so long as the reactor fuel remained hot, which it would for quite some time, its natural radioactive decay would continue, producing enough heat, called decay heat, to melt through the metal containers enclosing the reactor fuel. This same problem would later affect Fukushima. And then he goes through the whole process there. Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator by Gregory B. Jackso.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hartmann here with you. I've got a loose wire someplace. Okay, let's see here. Back to our phone calls. Jacqueline in Lakeport, California. Hey, Jacqueline, what's up?
Yeah, I wanted to mention my thoughts on Brother Northam.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I think he did wrong is his response was inconsistent. He should have either apologized or denied being in it, one or the other. But more to the point, he missed an opportunity to speak to the fact that in the time period when those costumes appeared in his yearbook, people really didn't think about race as an ongoing thing. I graduated in '81, and at that time we thought of race as an extinct thing, something on its way out. We never would have dreamed that it would resurge, or let alone we'd have a president who was a Nazi.
By race, you're talking about racism.
Racism.
Yeah.
We never thought it would resurge. You know, we thought it was over. So I think those costumes, while if you wore them now, would be clearly racist, because we now live in a resurged racist society. Back then, I think it was more comparable to wearing a costume of a dodo bird or a cave person, because it was the costume of something which was thought to be pretty much extinct.
Yeah, I'm not buying it.
Sure people
you know, I get that in 1985, I think was the year that he did this. The phrase cultural appropriation literally did not exist. Nobody even thought about that, or at least, you know, by and large, your average person, and certainly your average white person, was not thinking about that. But if he had dressed up in a Native American costume, that's what that would be. This was not cultural appropriation. This was cultural ridicule or racial ridicule or some variation on that.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, though, we didn't think of that as something. Though I was raised in just outside of Los Angeles, there were no black people where I lived, and very few, you know, a couple of families, and you treated them like royalty because racism was just not tolerated. The first time I became cognizant of current racism was through All in the Family. Archie Bunker, who, you know, represented racism as an idiot, you know, and that's how it should be. And I think that's where Northam, I think, was coming from. Now, it would have been great if his response had been, yeah, you know, we thought of that as an extinct thing, and
you know, the sense.
I wish he had said, you know, we were really progressing back then. Let's get back to doing that.
Yeah, the sense I get from him is he is still, to this day, so tone deaf on it. I mean, you know, just a couple days ago, he made this comment that, you know, in the 400 years ago in 1691, right here, and you know, on these shores, the first people were brought to this country in what was his phrase? It was the word for a person who basically has, and a lot of people came from Europe this way, you know, I will work for you for 7 years if you will give me my freedom. And, you know, there was a contractual thing, and he used the indentured servitude. Thank you, Nate. And that's what happened. That's what Ralph Northam said happened. And in fact, there were some very small number of people of color who came over as indentured servants, but the vast majority were just enslaved. And that was a practice that pretty much ended within a decade. And you know, after that, it was all slavery all the time. So. Jacqueline, thank you for the call. I get real uncomfortable with anything that sounds like apologizing for Northam. But anyhow, George in Santee, California. Hey, George, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, good morning, Tom. One of our freshman congresswomen is taking a little heat right now for, I guess, she made an anti-Semitic comment, and I would like to know how do we go about being critical of Israel's policy toward the Palestinians without being anti-Semitic?
Yeah, I do. First of all, what she said she said it's all about the Benjamins. She was quoting a song, and what she was saying was that members of Congress were voting, or my understanding of what she was saying was that some members of Congress were voting in favor of Israel or supporting Israel because they were getting money through AIPAC or other vehicles. It was interpreted as being a variation on when Trump was speaking to a Jewish group, to a Jewish group during the primaries. And he made the comment about, I don't need your money, but I know you guys have got all the money or something like that. I mean, he used the exact same racial trope, which is Jews are wealthy and Jews only care about money. And those are historic slurs that have been used against Jewish people forever. So she danced up to the edge of that, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps not. With that tweet, and she has, I think, appropriately apologized for it. But the larger conversation that we need to have is the one that you're raising, George. It is not anti-Semitic to say that you disagree with the policy of another country. It is not anti-Semitic to say that and in fact, about half of Israel disagrees with a lot of those policies. And there's a vigorous debate in Israel that does not exist in this country about the issues of what should be done with Palestinians, what should be done about Gaza. Is it time to even consider rolling back some of the settlements, things like that. I don't see where that has anything to do with anti-Semitism. There are certainly anti-Semites who are jumping on that bandwagon, but I think it's entirely appropriate to say, I disagree with the policy of Israel, or I disagree with any country funding a major lobbying organization that is buying votes in Congress, or that is working to influence votes in Congress, which pretty much every lobbying group is doing. That's why they're there. So George, that's my take on that. Jeremy in Terre Haute, Indiana. Hey, Jeremy, what's up?
Hey, yeah. So I was thinking instead of worrying about time zones and everything, just do like China national time, and I have a few points or discussion points for it as well. My brother, he was a teacher. Now he's like a director above principals, and the school boards meet together and decide when they're going to start school anyway. It doesn't even matter what the time zone or time, like the state changes the time zone or, changes daylight savings or not. The school's still deciding what time to start anyway. So why bother changing the whole state?
Yeah, that hadn't even occurred to me, Jeremy. China actually, and I think most Americans don't know this, China, which should span probably at least 6 or 8 time zones, probably 6 anyway, has the exact same time all across the country. And it's not that everybody gets up at 8 a.m. It's that at 8 a.m. in some parts of China, it's actually all based in Beijing. So, at 8 a.m. the sun is up and people are going to work. But if you're in, way off in the western part of the state, you don't get up and you don't go to work until 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. or noon, and because the entire country is the same time. And that's an interesting one. It doesn't, and holding that, I mean, it's a little peripheral to or tangential to the debate about whether we should have these 2 breaks in the year where we gain an hour and lose an hour and all go through jet lag collectively. It really doesn't have anything to do with that, but it is an interesting point. That's a good one. Jeremy, thank you for bringing that into the conversation. Dee in Pensacola, Florida. Hey, Dee, what's up?
Yes, I was listening on the earlier conversation. The lady said, well, back in '84, she didn't see, how was that offensive or
blackface.
And my thing is, for everyone that thinks something is offensive, put it in the Holocaust perspective and then see if it's offensive.
In the what?
In the Holocaust perspective.
Okay.
Because the reason why I say that is you only find offensive things in America that's, you see every day that are against black and minorities. If you do anything against Jews, you're automatically shut down. So I'm saying if it's a question of whether or not it's offensive, put it in a Jewish or a Holocaust perspective, and if it's offensive to the Jews, it's offensive to everybody else.
Or any other minority group, yeah.
But that seems what is, to me, that's automatically, if it's anything against the Jews, it's automatically seen offensive.
Well, it's not altogether true, Deeb, and in fact, it's not even broadly true. But and that is one of those anti-Semitic tropes that people are concerned about. But your point is well taken. Basically, anything that's going to hurt or offend or embarrass or humiliate, you if it was done to your group or any other group, that should be a clue. Ralph, that there's something wrong with that. Jack in Petaluma, California. Hey, Jack, what's up?
Yes, Tom. I wanted to speak to Mr. Pocan this morning, but as far as the racial issue, even as a child, I'm a 70-year-old man now, and as a child back in the 50s, we had Spanky in our gang. Mm-hmm. There was we all used to dress up as Spanky or our gang.
Well, Spanky was kind of the exception to the rule because he was characterized as just another one of the kids. I mean, he talked funny,
exactly.
but nobody thought twice about that, I don't think. But he wasn't characterized as being less than the others, as I recall anyway. I mean, it's been probably 40 years since I saw an Our Gang show, but that's my recollection of it.
Exactly.
Maybe
we all grew up together, just like those children did.
Yeah.
And so we, as a whole, I had black people that were very good friends of mine. I used to eat dinner at their houses because my dad died when I was very young in 1954. And so my mother had to work for a living, and I would eat at their homes. I had very good black friends. And when we had a flood one year in 1959, the black gentleman came up and helped us with furniture up into our second story.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you guys, you were in a part of a community, basically, and yeah, I get it.
Exactly.
Jack, wouldn't it be nice if we could have this kind of reconciliation and healing all across this country? Unfortunately, we have a man in the White House right now and an entire political party that supports him that seem completely committed to using race as a weapon, and a political weapon at that, the crassest of all kinds.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Defending America from the weapons of mass deception. Thom Hartmann here with you. We'll be back with your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Jim, listening to WBAI in New York City. Hey, Jim, what's up?
Hi, I have a thought about the daylight savings. I've mentioned this to several people, and relatives and so forth. I don't have a following yet, but I thought whatever the season is, spring ahead, fall back, that you move it 1/2 hour. You've got to compromise, and maybe no one's happy or everyone's happy, but just a thought.
But anyway, then your top of the hour times don't line up with the rest of the world.
All right. That could be a problem.
Yeah, I think so.
Anyway, the other thing about the loans, the car loans, or the Uber drivers, most of those, what I understand, are liar loans, just like the house loans that they had in the 2008.
Yeah, and the banksters are now taking car loans and they're creating these equity default swaps out of them. Just like they did.
Aware of that, yeah.
Yeah, just like they did in 2007. Only they're doing it with car loans and student loans now.
Now the people may not be borrowing $200,000 and $300,000 or $400,000, but there's a lot of people borrowing a lot of money to buy cars, like Uber people who, even if they're making some money, they've got this big loan to pay off on top of it.
Yep.
And just one other thing, I know a little off topic, but the Republicans are demonizing the Democrats as socialists. Oh, they're socialists, Oh my God! Even the president today mentioned that. and it's one of us interviewed here. And I just wondering if are the Republicans in the area of fascist?
Yes. The Republicans openly espouse fascism. They don't use the word, but fascism is the merger of corporate and state interests. I mean,
don't you think the Democrats ought to start using it and demonize them?
I do.
I mean, to play hardball.
I do. I absolutely do.
They are.
Yep. And
All right, that's my thoughts.
Yep, you're right. Well, your thoughts are solid, Jim, and they are fascist. Thank you. Kevin in Southold, New York. Hey, Kevin, thanks for watching Free Speech. What's up?
Hey, Professor, how are you?
I'm well. What's on your mind?
I wanted to thank you for turning me on to What Would Jefferson Do way back when.
Oh, thank you.
That opened my eyes to a lot of things. Hey, I want to talk about the governor of Virginia and something Joe Scarborough said this morning. I don't know if you heard what he said.
I did not.
He said, you know what, let's think about this. If the Democrats want to be consistent, tell the guy, the governor, who won't leave, you're out of the party. What do you think?
And therefore, he can't run for elective office as a Democrat in the future. He is now an independent, period. He's been purged.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's a possibility. It's a possibility. Part of me wants to say this is stuff people in Virginia should work out. Another part of me, says, but racism is an entirely national thing. It happens in every community, in every town, in every state. And, we all need to figure out how we're going to deal with this kind of thing, because this is not the first time this is going to come out.
Right. There's going to be a lot more.
Yeah, especially...
that just seems to be the thing that happened in Virginia during the 80s, even the 70s.
Yeah.
Way back when.
Yeah, and wait until millennials start running for political office in big numbers and people start pulling up what they did on Facebook when they were 12 years old.
Yep.
Right. it's going to get ugly. It's going to get real ugly. Kevin, in a whole lot of different directions. Kevin, thank you very much for the call. I appreciate it. And thank you for watching Free Speech TV. It's 50 minutes. 10 minutes before the hour. 50 minutes after the hour. Here on the Thom Hartmann Program, back with more of your calls in just a moment. We'll be right back. So would you like to watch the Thom Hartmann Program, all 3 hours of our program, anytime you'd like? It's available. Would you like to hear special content where we talk about, what the billionaires are up to, or climate change, or the newest things in science? There's all kinds of great content like that. That's also available. The place to find all this is the Thom Hartmann channel over on Patreon. Patreon.com, Patreon.com /Thom Hartmann, ThomHartmann, all run together. Patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. And there, when you become a supporter of the program through Patreon, you have access to the full 3-hour show every day, anytime you want, any place you want, and special content that we put up every single week that is unique specifically to our Patreon page. So check it out.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And how we can end homelessness in America. Welcome back. Bob in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Hey, Bob, what's up?
Well, hello, Tom. I feel like I've been waiting a while, and I feel like I've been, kind of on a mountain stream, and I've kind of washed downstream. So I'll try to find my way back to what I was originally going to talk to you about.
Okay, it says here you wanted to talk about Democrats holding Bill Barr accountable.
Yeah, it's just.
This is the guy who's going to be Attorney General in all probability, who, when he was Attorney General for George H.W. Bush, engineered the cover-up of Bush's complicity in Iran-Contra that involved 5 pardons, including Caspar Weinberger, and prevented the Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor at that time, from even continuing his investigation of George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you very much. That this man is now back in. It's like the dinosaurs continue to be brought forward.
Oh, it's like John Bolton.
And I'm old enough to remember that and much more with Reagan and then some before that. It kind of, and what you're talking about, daylight savings time, reminded me of the Chicago song. Does anybody really care what time it is?
Right.
And I think we ought to leave it. I think we ought to leave it on standard all the time, just to the seasons a little better.
Yeah, I'm with you, Bob.
I think our future remains.
Although, wouldn't it be spectacular if we could live in a world where we got up and went to work or did whatever we do when the sun comes up, and we go to sleep when the sun goes down, and just as the seasons change, our work days change. I mean, that'd be the coolest thing.
Well, it's not just cool. It might be really necessary in order to have a sustainable economy in the future that is more prevalent than a high-tech society, because actually we don't have another planet to go to.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Bob. And it was actually a point.
That's just wrong. It's so hypocritical, to return to what I originally wanted to say. It's so hypocritical. This presidency is just, it stinks.
Yeah, okay, I got it, Bob, and I can't disagree. Jeff in Portland, Oregon, listening on X-Ray FM. Hey, Jeff, what's up?
Hey, Tom, thanks for the great show and for taking my call.
Sure.
Always good to hear from Congressman Pocan. And you guys were talking about whether Trump will accept the spending deal. And I just wanted to point out that along with your article on your excellent article on abolishing the Electoral College, Common Dreams over the weekend also posted a piece written by David Dayen from Indy's Times, and it was titled, quote, "Meet the Militant Flight Attendant Leader Who Threatened a Strike and Helped Stop Trump's Shutdown," unquote. And I just read, Tom, that last year more American workers went on strike than in any year since 1986.
Wow.
And this president of the Flight Attendants Union, her name's Sarah Nelson, she seems like she might be the AOC of this new labor insurgency.
That's marvelous.
Yeah, but my question today for you, Tom, is, we heard what Congressman Pocan thinks is how it's going to play out, but how do you think Trump will respond to this new spending deal, and how should we prepare to react to his response?
You know, before Congressman Pocan offered his thoughts on the topic, my assumption was that Trump was going to buy the deal. He was going to take the deal that's been offered, and he was going to spin it, and Fox News and Right Wing Hate Radio would spin it as a great victory for him, and that would be the end of it. But what Mark Pocan said that you're referring to here, Jeff, and I'll repeat it real quickly for people who might not have heard the first hour of the show. What he said was he thinks that Trump wants to be the star of the show. He wants his name at the front of the news every single day, and so he has to have this constant tension, this constant battle going on between him and the Democrats, and he gains some political benefit from that as well. And therefore, Trump will say, okay, I'll go along with this, but I only want a 2-week continuing resolution or a 1-month continuing resolution, so that I can threaten to shut down the government again in a couple of weeks or in another month or so, and that keeps us distracted from what's going on with the Mueller investigation, what's going on with the Saudis murdering journalists, what's going on with Trump and Netanyahu, what's going on with all this other stuff that all these other areas where Trump is up to his eyeballs and in deep water, and the whole Trump crime family thing. Jeff, thank you for the call. That's my take on it. That's what I think is going to happen. So we'll find out tomorrow, right? In all probability, because if the House doesn't vote on something today, because of the 72-hour rule, the government will shut down on Friday. So I'm guessing that they're passing a continuing resolution right now. In any case, thanks so much for being with us today. Jefferson Smith will be with you for the next 3 days. Louise and I are heading out of town for a quickie here, and we'll be back on Monday. And Jefferson will be providing a really great live show for you tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag. You're it. We'll see you soon.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.